Sometimes the life you choose to escape the world becomes the very thing that pulls you back into it. For 20 years, Ezra Cole has lived alone in the Colorado mountains, finding peace in the silence that most men fear. He's a simple mountain man who asks for nothing and expects less. His days are spent hunting, his nights by the fire, and his heart at rest far from the troubles of civilization. But on one cold morning, while walking through the pine forest near his camp, Ezra notices something strange, a gap in the trees where mist hangs thick and unnatural. When he steps closer and peers through, what he sees stops him cold. What has been hiding in these woods all this time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other morning had started for the past 20 years. Ezra Cole woke before dawn, as he always did, when the first grey light began to seep through the gaps in the log walls of his cabin. He lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of the wilderness waking around him. A jay called from somewhere in the pines. The wind moved through the branches with a whisper that sounded almost like conversation. In the distance, he heard the faint rush of the creek that ran down from the high country. Swollen now with snowmelt from the peaks above, he rose slowly, feeling the stiffness in his joints that came with age and solitude. 62 years old now, though he had long ago stopped marking the passage of time with any precision. The years blended together out here, measured not by calendars, but by seasons, by the migration of elk, by the first snow and the last frost. His cabin was small but well built, constructed with his own hands when he first came to these mountains. One room, with a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall, a sturdy table he'd made from pine, a single chair, and a bed frame lashed together with leather cord. His possessions were few: a battered tin coffee pot, a cast-iron skillet worn smooth with use, a rifle mounted above the door, a hunting knife that had been his father's, and on the small shelf beside his bed, a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his observations of the natural world. Sketches of animal tracks, notes about weather patterns, and beneath all of that, buried in the earlier pages, the remnants of another life. He built up the fire from last night's embers, adding kindling until the flames caught and held. The coffee pot went on to boil. While he waited, he opened the journal to a blank page near the back. The early pages he never looked at anymore. Those pages held memories of Sarah and little Emma, sketches he'd made of their faces so he wouldn't forget. Words written in the raw grief of those first terrible months after they'd died, 22 years ago now. Scarlet fever had taken them both within a week of each other. He'd been away, working as a scout for the cavalry, tracking Cheyenne raiders up near the Wyoming border. By the time he'd gotten word and ridden home, they were already in the ground. He could still remember standing at those two graves, hat in his hands, unable to form words, unable to think, unable to breathe. He'd sold everything after that. The little house in Denver, the furniture Sarah had chosen so carefully, Emma's toys and clothes. He'd kept only what he could carry on his back and his father's old cavalry revolver, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Then he'd ridden west and north until he'd found this place, where the mountains rose up like cathedral walls, and a man could live his whole life without seeing another human soul if he chose to, and that's exactly what Ezra Cole had done. He poured his coffee and took it outside, standing on the narrow porch he'd built along the front of the cabin. The air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Below him, the valley spread out in layers of green and grey, forest giving way to meadow, meadow rising again to forest, and beyond it all, the high peaks still crowned with snow, even though it was nearly June. He knew every inch of this country, every game trail and water source, every stand of aspen, and every hidden meadow where the elk came to graze. He knew where the trout gathered in the deep pools of the creek, and which ridge offered the best view of approaching storms. He knew the territory the way a man knows his own home, because that's what it had become to him. His routine rarely varied. After coffee, he'd check his snares and traps, following a circuit that took most of the morning. Then he'd gather firewood or tend to whatever other tasks needed doing. Afternoons were for hunting if meat was low, or fishing, or simply walking through the forest, observing, taking mental notes that he'd later transfer to his journal. Evenings he spent by the fire cooking simple meals, reading from the 2 books he owned, a Bible his mother had given him and a collection of Emerson's essays that Sarah had loved, or simply sitting in silence, watching the flames. Once a month, sometimes less often in winter, he'd make the ride down to Pinewood, the small settlement 3 hours to the east. He'd trade pelts and smoked meat for coffee, flour, salt, ammunition, and the few other things he couldn't make or find on his own. He never stayed long. The noise of civilization, even a place as small as Pinewood, set his teeth on edge after so many years of quiet. But there was one person in Pinewood whose company he didn't mind. Samuel, the man who ran the general store, was a few years younger than Ezra, but had the manner of someone much older, patient and measured in his speech. He never pried into Ezra's business, never asked why a man would choose to live alone in the high country. He simply conducted their transactions with courtesy, and sometimes, if the store was empty, they'd share a cup of coffee and talk about practical things. Weather, game populations, the quality of that year's pelts. Samuel had moved to Pinewood about 5 years ago, taking over the store from the previous owner. He was educated, that much was clear from the way he spoke, but he seemed content with his quiet life, serving the handful of families and the occasional prospectors who passed through. There was something solid about him, something Ezra instinctively trusted, though he couldn't have said exactly why. This morning, as Ezra finished his coffee and prepared to begin his rounds, he found himself thinking about his next trip to town. Supplies were running low. He'd need to go within the week. He set his cup inside and gathered his equipment. The leather possibles bag that carried his fire-starting kit, some dried meat and other essentials. His rifle, his knife, a coil of rope. He dressed in layers against the morning chill, wool shirt, leather vest. A coat made from deerskin. He'd tanned himself. The sun was fully up now, though it would be another hour before it cleared the eastern ridgeline and brought real warmth to the valley. Ezra stepped off the porch and began walking north, toward the line of traps he'd set near the beaver ponds. The forest wrapped around him like an old friend. He moved quietly, automatically, his feet finding the path without conscious thought. This was his meditation, his church, his reason for drawing breath. Out here, the pain of the past couldn't reach him. Out here, there were no memories of small hands reaching for him. No echo of Sarah's laugh. No empty rooms that should have been filled with life. Out here, there was only the present moment, the immediate reality of survival, the honest relationship between a man and the wild. He checked the first 3 traps and found them empty. The 4th held a rabbit, dead and already stiff. He reset the trap and continued on. By mid-morning, he'd collected 2 more rabbits and spotted fresh elk sign near the upper meadow. Good. The herd was moving back to their summer range. It was on his way back, taking a different route than usual, that he noticed something odd. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to develop an instinct for things that didn't belong. A broken branch where no animal would have broken it. Tracks that seemed off somehow. Silence where there should have been birdsong. His senses had kept him alive during his years as a scout, and they hadn't dulled, even after 2 decades of peaceful solitude. What caught his attention now was visual rather than auditory. He was walking through a section of forest he knew well, a dense stand of pine and spruce that covered the northwestern slope of the valley. The trees here grew thick and straight, competing for light, their branches interwoven into a canopy that kept the forest floor in perpetual twilight. But ahead of him, perhaps 100 yards distant, there was a gap. He stopped walking and studied it. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a natural clearing, the kind created when an old tree falls and takes its neighbors down with it. But something about it felt wrong. The gap was too regular, too defined, and there was mist, heavy, thick mist that hung in the air even though the morning sun should have burned off any fog hours ago. Ezra stood still, watching. The mist didn't move the way natural fog moved. It seemed to hover, almost purposefully, obscuring whatever lay beyond. He'd walked past this area before, many times over the years, but he'd never noticed this gap. Had it always been there, hidden by angle and shadow? Or was this something new? His instincts told him to be cautious. After 20 years of solitude, those instincts were sharp. He moved forward slowly, rifle held ready, though he didn't expect danger. More likely, he'd find nothing more interesting than a deadfall, or perhaps a small sinkhole. But as he drew closer, the feeling of wrongness intensified. The mist was definitely unnatural. It clung to the trees at the edges of the gap like something alive, and beyond it he could see only shadows and dim shapes. Ezra reached the edge of the gap and stopped. The ground here showed signs of passage, not animal tracks, but the subtle disturbance that came from human boots. Multiple sets of them, trying to move carefully, but leaving traces nonetheless for someone who knew how to read them. His pulse quickened slightly. People, out here. In country he'd considered his own private domain for 20 years. He peered into the mist, straining to see through it. For a moment he saw nothing. Then the air shifted slightly, and the mist parted just enough for him to catch a glimpse of what lay beyond. What he saw made him freeze in place. His breath caught in his throat. Beyond the gap, hidden in a fold of land he'd never known existed, was an encampment. Not a temporary camp of hunters or prospectors, but something more permanent. He could make out the shapes of tents or structures, the movement of people and something else, machinery of some kind. Strange shapes that didn't belong in this wilderness. Ezra stood perfectly still, his mind racing. He'd been living 3 hours from this place for 20 years and never known it existed. How was that possible? He watched for several more minutes, trying to understand what he was seeing, but the mist closed in again, obscuring his view. He could hear faint sounds now, voices, though too distant to make out words, and a rhythmic mechanical sound, like the working of a pump or engine. Every instinct told him to turn around and walk away. He'd come to these mountains to escape the world of men and their complications. Whatever this was, it wasn't his concern, but even as he thought this, he knew it wasn't true. This was his territory. These were his mountains, and whatever was happening beyond that gap had been happening right under his nose. He needed to know more. But not now, not in daylight when he might be spotted. Ezra backed away carefully, making sure to leave no obvious sign of his presence. When he was far enough from the gap, he turned and made his way back to his cabin, his mind churning with questions. That night, he sat at his table with his journal open in front of him. But for the first time in months, he couldn't find words to write. He stared at the blank page and thought about the gap in the forest, the unnatural mist, and the hidden encampment beyond. Finally, he closed the journal and looked at the shelf where his father's revolver rested, still wrapped in oilcloth after all these years. He'd promised himself he'd never touch it again. That part of his life was over, but as he sat in the firelight, listening to the wind move through the pines, Ezra Cole knew that something had changed. The peace he'd carved out for himself in these mountains had just been disturbed, and there would be no ignoring it. Tomorrow, he would go back. Tomorrow, he would find out what was hiding in his forest, and depending on what he found, his 20 years of solitude might finally be coming to an end. Ezra waited until well after dark before he made his move. The moon was only a thin crescent, which suited his purposes. He'd spent enough nights moving through hostile territory during his scouting days to know that darkness was an ally, if you knew how to use it properly. He dressed in dark clothing and left his rifle behind. It was too cumbersome for what he needed to do tonight, which was observe, not fight. He carried only his knife, some rope, and a small leather pouch containing flint and steel in case he found himself in trouble and needed to signal or start a fire quickly. The walk to the gap took him 40 minutes in the darkness. He moved slowly, carefully, stopping frequently to listen. The night forest had its own rhythms, its own sounds, and anything out of place would warn him of danger. When he reached the edge of the gap, he crouched low and waited, letting his eyes adjust fully to the darkness. The unnatural mist was still there, though thinner now, wisping between the trees like smoke. Beyond it, he could see the faint glow of campfires. Ezra moved forward, staying low, using every scrap of cover. As he penetrated deeper into the gap, the ground began to slope downward, and he realized why he'd never discovered this place before. It was a hidden valley, a geological pocket completely concealed from any normal vantage point. You had to be right on top of it to know it existed. The mist seemed to be rising from the valley itself, perhaps from some underground water source. It created a natural screen that would make the encampment invisible from any distance. He found a position on a small rocky outcrop that gave him a view of the valley floor below while keeping him hidden in shadow. What he saw made his blood run cold. The encampment was larger than he'd thought. There were at least a dozen tents arranged in rough rows, and several more permanent structures that looked like they'd been there for months. Lanterns hung from posts, casting pools of yellow light. He counted people moving about, easily 40 or more, but it was the machinery that truly shocked him. Even from this distance, even in the uncertain light, he could see devices that seemed impossibly advanced. There were large pumps connected to long pipes that disappeared into the mountainside. There were generators or engines of some kind, quietly chugging away. There were crates and barrels stacked everywhere, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. This wasn't some temporary mining operation. This was an organized, well-funded enterprise. Ezra watched as people moved about their business. Some were clearly workers, dressed in rough clothes, moving with the tired gait of men and women at the end of a long day. Others were guards, armed with rifles, standing watch at regular intervals around the perimeter, and then there were the ones who didn't fit either category. As Ezra watched, a group of rough-looking men emerged from one of the larger tents. Even from a distance, he could tell these were hard cases. The way they carried themselves, the way others moved out of their way, these were men accustomed to violence. One of them stepped into the light of a nearby lantern, and Ezra felt recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew that face. Red Hand Morrison, a notorious outlaw who'd been terrorizing the territory for the better part of 5 years. There were wanted posters for him in every town from here to Santa Fe, offering $1,000 for his capture, dead or alive. What was Red Hand Morrison doing in a hidden valley in Ezra's mountains? As if in answer to his question, a woman emerged from the central structure, which appeared to be a large tent reinforced with wooden framing. She was tall, dressed in practical but well-made clothing that suggested money and authority. Her dark hair was pulled back severely from her face. Even from this distance, Ezra could see that she commanded immediate respect. The rough men straightened when she appeared. The workers stopped what they were doing and turned to listen. Her voice carried across the valley, clear and educated. "Gentlemen, we're behind schedule. I need the eastern shaft completed by week's end, which means double shifts until it's done. Anyone who has a problem with that can collect their pay and leave." No one moved. No one spoke. "Good," the woman continued. "Mr. Morrison, I need you to take a team to Pinewood tomorrow. We're running low on black powder and timber supports." "Be discreet as always," Red Hand nodded. "Yes, ma'am, Miss Blackwood." Blackwood. Ezra filed the name away. The woman, Victoria Blackwood apparently, continued issuing orders with the efficiency of a military commander. She spoke about extraction rates, about refining processes, about shipment schedules. She mentioned buyers back east, powerful men who were waiting for product. As Ezra listened, he began to piece together what was happening here. They were mining something from the mountain, something valuable enough to justify this elaborate operation, something that required secrecy and the protection of known outlaws. He shifted his position slightly to get a better view of the eastern part of the camp, where most of the machinery was concentrated. That's when he saw the families. They were clustered in a separate area, away from the main work zones. He could see women hanging laundry, children playing quietly in the shadows between tents. A man sat on a stump, head in his hands, the picture of exhaustion or despair. These weren't outlaws. These were ordinary people, families. What were they doing here? Ezra watched for another hour, memorizing the layout of the camp, counting guards, noting the routine. He saw Victoria Blackwood make another round, this time stopping to speak with some of the workers. Her tone was different with them, not cruel but firm, almost businesslike. One man tried to speak to her, gesturing toward the area where the families were staying, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture and walked away. Near one of the machinery tents, Ezra spotted something that made him pause. There was a piece of equipment sitting on a workbench, partially disassembled. Even from a distance, he could tell it was unlike anything he'd seen before. It was made of brass and copper, with intricate gears and dials. Some kind of measuring device, perhaps, or a control mechanism for the larger machines. He needed to get closer to understand more about what was being mined and why it required such unusual equipment. But the guards were positioned well, with clear lines of sight across most of the valley floor. Getting down there without being spotted would be nearly impossible. As he considered his options, a young guard made his rounds near Ezra's position. The man was young, maybe 20, and didn't look particularly alert. He stopped to light a cigarette, his rifle slung carelessly over his shoulder. Ezra held perfectly still, barely breathing. The guard stood less than 30 feet away, so close that Ezra could hear him humming quietly to himself. If the young man happened to look up and to his right, if his eyes adjusted to the darkness in just the right way, he might spot Ezra's silhouette against the rocks. After what felt like an eternity, the guard finished his cigarette and moved on. Ezra waited another 15 minutes, then began his careful retreat. He'd seen enough for one night. He had information now, but that information only led to more questions. Who was Victoria Blackwood? What were they mining? Why were their families here, and were they here willingly? How was Red Hand Morrison involved, and were there other wanted men in the camp? And most importantly, what was Ezra Cole going to do about it? The walk back to his cabin gave him plenty of time to think, but no easy answers presented themselves. By the time he reached home, false dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at his table and forced himself to write everything down in his journal, every detail he could remember. The layout of the camp, the number of people, the strange machines, Victoria Blackwood's orders, Red Hand Morrison's presence. When he was done writing, he sat back and stared at the words on the page. For 20 years, he'd successfully avoided human complications. For 20 years, he'd lived by a simple code, mind his own business, hurt no one, ask nothing of anyone. But this felt different. This was happening in his territory, in his mountains. And those families, he kept thinking about the children he'd seen, playing quietly in the shadows. They reminded him too much of Emma, of the life that had been stolen from him. He thought about Red Hand Morrison and the other outlaws. Men like that didn't run legitimate operations. Whatever was happening in that hidden valley, it wasn't legal, and it probably wasn't safe for the ordinary people caught up in it. Ezra stood and walked to the shelf where his father's revolver rested. He picked up the oilcloth bundle and held it in his hands, feeling its familiar weight. He could walk away. He could pack up his few possessions, head deeper into the mountains, find another place to live his solitary life. No one would blame him. No one would even know, but even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't do it. Couldn't do it. Something had been awakened in him when he'd peered through that gap in the forest. Some old sense of duty or justice that he'd thought was dead. He unwrapped the revolver carefully. It was a Colt Army model, well-maintained despite years of disuse. His father had carried it through the Mexican War and later during his service on the frontier. When the old man had died, he'd left it to Ezra with a simple instruction: use it to protect those who can't protect themselves. Ezra had failed to protect his own family. He'd been off chasing outlaws when Sarah and Emma needed him most. But maybe, just maybe, he could protect someone else's family now. He loaded the revolver with steady hands, then wrapped it back in the oilcloth and returned it to the shelf. Not yet. First, he needed more information. He needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with before he made any moves. Over the next 3 days, Ezra conducted careful reconnaissance of the hidden valley. He mapped every approach, every guard position, every tent and structure. He noted the changing of the guard shifts. He observed who seemed to be in charge of what operations. He watched the families and tried to gauge their situation. What he learned disturbed him deeply. The families weren't there by choice. That much became clear. They were housed separately, guarded more closely than the workers. When they moved around the camp, they did so with obvious reluctance, with the body language of people who'd been threatened or coerced. He also learned more about the mining operation. They were extracting some kind of dark metallic ore from deep in the mountain. He watched as they brought out samples, carefully packed in wooden crates lined with straw. The ore seemed to be exceptionally valuable. Victoria Blackwood handled it personally, never trusting it to the workers. On the fourth day, he decided he needed to make contact with someone in the camp. The question was who and how. That evening, he watched as one of the men from the family area was sent out to gather firewood from the forest edge. The man was older, maybe 50, with the weathered look of a farmer or rancher. He worked slowly, glancing back over his shoulder frequently at the guard who was supposed to be watching him, but had gotten distracted in conversation with another guard. Ezra made his decision. He circled around through the trees, moving silently, and positioned himself where the man would pass on his way back to camp with his load of wood. When the man came close enough, Ezra stepped out from behind a tree, one hand raised in a peaceful gesture. "Easy now," he said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt you." The man nearly dropped his armload of wood. His eyes went wide with fear and something else, hope maybe, or desperation. "Who?" the man started, but Ezra cut him off. "No time for questions. Are you here willingly?" The man shook his head quickly. "No, none of us are. She's keeping us here until the job is done. Says we'll be paid and let go, but..." He glanced back toward the camp. "I don't think any of us believe that anymore." "How many families?" 17 people total. 5 children among them." Ezra felt his jaw tighten. "I'm going to help you, but I need time to figure out how. Can you keep quiet about seeing me?" The man nodded eagerly. Yes, sir, I can. But please, my daughter, she's only 7 years old. If something happens to us..." "Nothing's going to happen," Ezra said, with more confidence than he felt. "What's your name?" Thomas Brennan. "I'm a farmer from over near Boulder. We got into debt after a bad season, and Miss Blackwood offered us work. Said it was honest labor, good pay. By the time we got here and realized what kind of operation this really was..." He shook his head. "They took our horses. Said we'd get them back when the job was done. But like I said, I don't think any of us are walking out of here." "You will," Ezra promised. "Just stay quiet, keep your head down and wait." "I'll figure something out." Thomas Brennan gripped his arm. "Bless you, sir. Bless you. What's your name?" "Ezra Cole. Now get back before they miss you." He watched Thomas return to the camp, then melted back into the forest. His mind was already working through possibilities, strategies, the same kind of tactical thinking he'd employed during his scouting days. The situation was worse than he'd thought. Victoria Blackwood wasn't just running an illegal mining operation. She was holding innocent people hostage. And if Thomas was right about not letting them leave, well, that meant she was planning to eliminate witnesses when the job was done. Ezra made his way back to his cabin in the darkness. He had decisions to make now. Big decisions. He couldn't handle this alone. He needed help, which meant he needed to involve the law. But could he trust the law? Red Hand Morrison was here, operating freely. That suggested someone in authority was being paid to look the other way. He'd have to go to Pinewood, feel out the situation, see if he could find an honest lawman. And if he couldn't find one there, he'd have to ride to the next town, and the next, until he found someone who'd listen. As he lay in his bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Ezra thought about the strange brass and copper device he'd seen on that workbench. Whatever it was, it represented technology beyond anything he understood. This operation had resources, had backing from people with money and influence. He was one old man against what appeared to be a well-funded conspiracy. The odds were poor. The risks were enormous. If he failed, those families would die, and probably him along with them. But he'd made a promise to Thomas Brennan. And more importantly, he'd made a promise to himself when he'd unwrapped his father's revolver. Some things mattered more than survival. Some things mattered more than peace and quiet and the comfort of solitude. His wife Sarah had believed that. His daughter Emma would have believed that too, if she'd lived long enough to understand such things. Tomorrow he'd ride to Pinewood. Tomorrow he'd start down a path that would likely end in violence and blood. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, Ezra Cole felt something like purpose stirring in his chest. The gap in the forest had revealed more than just a hidden valley. It had revealed a truth he'd been running from for 2 decades. You couldn't hide from the world forever. Sooner or later the world found you, and when it did, you had to decide what kind of man you were going to be. Ezra had made his decision. The ride to Pinewood took longer than usual. Ezra found himself stopping frequently, watching his back trail, making sure he wasn't being followed. His years in the wilderness had made him cautious by nature, but now that caution had transformed into something sharper, more focused. He was entering dangerous territory, not just physically but politically. He'd wrapped his father's revolver in oilcloth and tucked it into his saddlebag. It felt strange to be carrying it again after so many years. The weight of it seemed to carry more than just physical presence. It carried memory, responsibility, the ghost of the man he used to be. Pinewood appeared in the distance around mid-afternoon. It wasn't much of a town, a single main street with perhaps 20 buildings total. A general store, a saloon, a stable, a small church, and a handful of houses. The marshal's office sat at the far end of the street, a squat wooden building with bars on the windows. Ezra guided his horse to the stable first, arranging for it to be fed and watered. The stable hand was a young man he didn't recognize, probably new to town. They exchanged few words beyond the necessary transaction. From there, he walked to the general store. The familiar bell chimed as he pushed open the door. Samuel was behind the counter, sorting through a delivery of canned goods. He looked up and smiled when he saw Ezra Cole, as I live and breathe. Wasn't expecting you for another week or two. Samuel came around the counter and extended his hand. Good to see you. They shook hands. Samuel's grip was firm, confident. Ezra had always appreciated that about the man. There was no hesitation in him, no false warmth or exaggerated courtesy. Just solid, straightforward friendliness. Needed to make a run sooner than planned, Ezra said. Running low on a few things. Well, you came to the right place. Give me your list, and I'll gather it up for you. Ezra handed over the list he'd prepared, watching Samuel's face as the storekeeper read through it. More ammunition than usual, extra rope, some medical supplies. If Samuel noticed anything unusual about the order, he didn't comment on it. This'll take me a few minutes to pull together, Samuel said. Why don't you have a seat? I'd just put on a fresh pot of coffee, Ezra accepted gratefully. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what he needed. He sat on the wooden bench near the counter and tried to figure out how to broach the subject of the hidden valley without revealing too much too soon. Samuel worked efficiently, gathering items from the shelves and storeroom. After a few minutes of comfortable silence, he spoke without looking up from his work. You seem troubled, Ezra. Something on your mind? Ezra considered how to answer. Samuel had always struck him as trustworthy, but these were unusual circumstances. He decided to start carefully, feeling out the situation. I've been noticing some unusual activity in the mountains, he said. People moving through country where they shouldn't be. Wondered if you'd heard anything about it. Samuel paused in his work and turned to look at Ezra directly. His expression had changed, become more serious. What kind of activity? Can't say for certain, but enough to make me curious. Ezra sipped his coffee. Also been wondering about the law in these parts. The marshal, he honest? Samuel set down the can he'd been holding. He walked over to the front window and looked out at the street, as if checking to see if anyone was nearby. Then he came back and sat down on the bench next to Ezra, his voice lowered. The marshal died 6 months ago. Heart gave out. We've got a deputy marshal now, name of Wade Garrett. Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. He's not what I'd call reliable. Corrupt? I couldn't prove it, but yes, that's my sense. There've been some odd things happening around town. People showing up with more money than they should have. Supplies going missing from warehouses. And Garrett doesn't seem interested in asking questions about any of it. Ezra felt his stomach sink. He'd hoped for better news. Any other law nearby? Someone who might be more trustworthy. Nearest honest marshal I know of is 3 days' ride north in Silver Creek. But even if you rode there, by the time you explained the situation and brought him back, Samuel shook his head. Whatever you've stumbled onto, Ezra, if it's as serious as I think it might be, time is probably a factor. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Samuel spoke again, his voice even quieter. About 2 months ago, a farmer and his family came through town. Name of Brennan. Thomas Brennan. Nice people. They were heading west, supposedly to take jobs at some mining operation in the mountains. They never came back through town, and when I asked Garrett about it, he told me to mind my own business. Ezra's pulse quickened. Thomas Brennan, the same man he'd spoken to in the forest. There were other families too? At least 4 that I know of. Maybe more. All of them heading to the same place. All of them promising to stop back through Pinewood when their work was done. None of them ever returned. Samuel studied Ezra's face. You've seen something, haven't you? That's why you're asking these questions. Ezra made a decision. Samuel was clearly paying attention, clearly concerned about the missing families. And more than that, there was something in the way he asked questions, in the careful way he gathered information, that reminded Ezra of investigators he'd known during his army days. There's a hidden valley, about 3 hours northwest of here, Ezra said quietly. Big operation, mining something valuable. There are families there, being held against their will. There are also known outlaws working as guards. The whole thing is being run by a woman named Victoria Blackwood. Samuel's reaction was subtle but telling. His eyes narrowed slightly and he leaned forward. Victoria Blackwood. You're certain of that name? Heard it spoken directly. Why, you know her? Not personally, but I know of her. She's the widow of a Union colonel who died under questionable circumstances about 5 years ago. After his death, she inherited his considerable estate, but it wasn't enough apparently. Last I heard, she'd gotten involved with some industrial concerns back east. Mining, manufacturing, things of that nature. Samuel stood and walked to the counter, pulling out a ledger. He flipped through pages until he found what he was looking for. She's been buying supplies through this store for the past 6 months. Always pays in cash, always through intermediaries. I never connected it to the missing families until now. Ezra joined him at the counter and looked at the ledger entries. They showed regular purchases of black powder, timber supports, machine parts, lamp oil, and large quantities of food. The kind of supplies needed for a major operation. This confirms what I saw, Ezra said. The operation is big, well-funded, and it's been going on for months right under everyone's noses. Samuel closed the ledger. The families, are they safe? For now. But I don't think they will be once the mining operation is finished. They've seen too much, know too much. Then we need to get them out. Ezra was about to respond when the bell over the door chimed. Both men turned to see Deputy Marshal Wade Garrett step into the store. Garrett was a big man, running to fat around the middle with a florid face and small, calculating eyes. He wore his badge prominently on his vest and carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never been seriously challenged. Samuel, he said, nodding to the storekeeper. Then his eyes fell on Ezra. Don't think I know you. Just passing through, Ezra said evenly. Picking up some supplies. Garrett looked him over slowly, taking in the worn clothing, the weathered face, the careful way Ezra held himself. Mountain man, are you? Something like that? We don't get many of your kind in town anymore. Most of the old-timers have died off or moved on. Garrett walked to the counter and leaned against it, his posture deliberately casual, but his attention fixed on Ezra. You wouldn't happen to have been up in the high country northwest of here, would you? Near the old pine stands? Ezra felt the danger in the question, but kept his expression neutral. I range pretty wide. Hard to say exactly where I've been and where I haven't. Huh. Garrett's eyes narrowed. Reason I ask is, we've had reports of someone prowling around up there. Trespassing on private claims. The owners of those claims are concerned about their property rights being respected. Private claims? Ezra asked. I wasn't aware anyone had filed claims in that area. Well, they have, and they're well within their rights to protect their investment. Garrett straightened up, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. So if you happen to be ranging up that way, I'd advise you to range somewhere else. For your own safety, of course. The threat was clear. Ezra met the deputy marshal's eyes and saw everything he needed to see there. Garrett was on Victoria Blackwood's payroll, no question about it. I appreciate the advice, Ezra said. Garrett held his gaze for another moment, then turned to Samuel. I'll be back tomorrow to pick up that special order we discussed. Make sure it's ready. It'll be ready, Samuel said. After Garrett left, the two men stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, Samuel spoke, his voice tight with anger. That confirms it. He's warning you off, which means they know someone's been watching the camp. Probably spotted my tracks, Ezra admitted. I was careful but not careful enough, apparently. This is worse than I thought. Samuel paced behind the counter. If Garrett is involved, we can't trust local law at all. And if we ride for help from Silver Creek, those families might not have that much time. Ezra watched the storekeeper pace, struck by how personally Samuel seemed to be taking this. Most men would have advised caution, would have suggested waiting for proper authorities. But Samuel was already talking about we and planning action. Why are you so interested in helping? Ezra asked. Most men would say this isn't their fight. Samuel stopped pacing and looked at Ezra for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he walked to the front door, locked it, and flipped the sign to closed. He returned to where Ezra stood and spoke in a low voice. My name isn't Samuel Foster, or at least that's not my only name. I'm Samuel Frost, Texas Ranger, currently working undercover. Ezra felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. A Texas Ranger? Here in Pinewood, running a general store, Samuel continued, speaking quickly now. I've been here for 6 months, investigating reports of corruption in the Territorial Marshal Service. We knew something was wrong. Money moving in strange ways, criminals operating too freely in this region. But we didn't know what we were looking for exactly. Now I think we found it. He pulled out a key and unlocked a drawer under the counter. From it, he removed a silver badge and a letter with an official seal. This is my commission, and this letter is from the captain of my ranger company, giving me authority to operate in this territory. Ezra examined both documents. They were legitimate, no question about it. He looked up at Samuel, Ranger Frost, with new eyes. Why didn't you tell me before? Because I couldn't be sure who to trust. Even now, I'm taking a risk telling you. But given what you've discovered and given what's at stake, he shook his head. I need your help, Ezra. Those families need both of us. Ezra sat down heavily on the bench. This changed everything. He wasn't just one old man trying to figure out how to help some trapped families. He had an ally now, and not just any ally, but a Texas Ranger. What's the full scope of your investigation? He asked. Samuel laid it out methodically. For the past 6 months, he'd been tracking money flows and criminal activity. He'd identified Deputy Marshal Garrett as corrupt almost immediately. But Garrett was small time, just a local player. The real money was coming from somewhere else, funding something big. Samuel had suspected a major mining operation, but he hadn't been able to locate it or prove it existed. The families that went missing, I knew they were the key, Samuel said. But I couldn't find where they'd gone. The high country is vast, and I couldn't search it all while maintaining my cover here in town. Now you know where they are. Yes. And now we have a choice to make. Samuel leaned against the counter. I can send word to my captain, get Ranger backup. But that will take 4 or 5 days minimum. In that time, Victoria Blackwood might finish her operation and eliminate the witnesses. Or we can act now, Ezra said. Or we act now. 2 men against 40, many of them armed and dangerous. Samuel smiled grimly. I've been in worse situations, but not many. I was a frontier scout for 15 years, Ezra said. Fought Cheyenne, Comanche, tracked renegades through Badlands. I know how to handle long odds. I believe you do. But this isn't a decision to make lightly. If we go in there and fail, those families die, and probably us with them. Ezra thought about Thomas Brennan, about the man's desperate hope when they'd spoken in the forest. He thought about the children he'd seen playing in the shadows between the tents. He thought about his own daughter, Emma, who would have been about that age if she'd lived. "I'm going after them," he said quietly. "With your help or without it. But I'd rather have your help," Samuel nodded slowly. "Then we do this together, but we do it smart. We plan carefully, we use every advantage we have, and we don't take unnecessary risks." Agreed. They spent the next hour making preliminary plans. Samuel pulled out a map and Ezra marked the location of the hidden valley, drawing in details about the camp layout, guard positions, and the location where the families were being held. They discussed timing, weapons, possible approaches. As they worked, Ezra felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years, the sense of being part of something larger than himself, of working toward a purpose that mattered. It was frightening and exhilarating at the same time. Finally, Samuel rolled up the map. "I need to maintain my cover here for now. If Garrett gets suspicious, we lose our element of surprise. But I can prepare supplies, weapons, anything you need. You go back to your cabin and continue your surveillance. Learn everything you can about their routine, their weaknesses. We'll meet again in 2 days and finalize our plan," Ezra agreed. Samuel helped him load his supplies onto his horse, adding some extra items he thought might be useful. A good length of strong rope, some lamp oil, extra matches, and a box of ammunition that hadn't been on Ezra's original list. As Ezra prepared to leave, Samuel gripped his arm. "Be careful out there. Garrett warning you off means they're alert now. They'll be watching for intruders. I'll be careful. And Ezra," Samuel's expression was serious, "thank you for caring about those families when you could have just walked away." Ezra didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded. He mounted his horse and rode out of town, taking a different route than he'd used coming in, just in case Garrett was having him followed. The ride back gave him time to process everything. He had an ally now, a trained lawman with resources and authority. But he also had a target on his back. Garrett's warning had been clear. They knew someone was snooping around, and they'd be taking measures to protect their operation. That night, back in his cabin, Ezra took out his father's revolver and cleaned it thoroughly. He loaded it carefully, checking each cartridge. Then he took down his rifle and cleaned it too, making sure both weapons were in perfect working order. On the table in front of him sat the torn half of a wanted poster he'd picked up in Pinewood, one of several that had been posted outside the marshal's office. It showed the face of Red Hand Morrison, offering a $1,000 reward for information leading to his capture. The poster was old, faded, but Morrison's face was clear enough. Ezra studied it, committing every detail to memory. Red Hand Morrison was the kind of man who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. If it came to a confrontation, Ezra would need to be ready. He thought about Victoria Blackwood too, the educated woman commanding that camp with such efficiency. What drove someone like her to take such risks, to hold innocent families hostage, to operate outside the law? Money, certainly, but there seemed to be something else as well, some kind of burning determination that went beyond simple greed. It didn't matter, ultimately. Whatever her reasons, she was putting innocent people in danger, and that couldn't be allowed to continue. Ezra extinguished his lamp and lay down on his bed, but sleep was a long time coming. His mind kept running through scenarios, possibilities, dangers. 2 men against 40, long odds, Samuel had said. But Ezra had fought against long odds before and survived. The question was whether he still had it in him. He was 62 years old, 20 years removed from his life as a scout and fighter. His reflexes weren't what they used to be. His stamina wasn't what it used to be. He couldn't move as quickly or as quietly as he once could, but he still had his mind and his experience and his knowledge of the mountains. And now he had Samuel Frost, a Texas Ranger who knew his business. Together they might just have a chance. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Ezra's last thought was of the wooden toy horse he'd found near the camp, a child's toy, dropped and left behind. Tomorrow he'd begin the work of making sure that Child and all the others made it home safely, whatever it took. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with low clouds threatening rain. Ezra rose early and made his way back to the hidden valley. approaching from a different angle than before, careful to leave minimal traces of his passage. He'd been watching the camp for perhaps an hour when something caught his eye near the eastern perimeter. A small object lying in the grass, half hidden by morning dew. He waited until the nearby guard had moved on his rounds, then crept forward to investigate. It was a wooden toy horse, small enough to fit in a child's hand. The craftsmanship was simple but careful. Someone had spent time carving it, smoothing the edges, making sure there were no splinters. One of the legs was slightly shorter than the others, giving it a distinctive lean. Ezra picked it up and turned it over in his hands. The wood was still relatively fresh, not weathered by long exposure to the elements. It had been dropped recently within the past day or two. He thought of Emma, his daughter. She'd had a toy horse like this, carved by his own hands during a long winter when she was 4 years old. She'd carried it everywhere, even slept with it clutched in her small fist. After she died, he'd buried it with her, unable to bear keeping it. The memory hit him with unexpected force, a wave of grief that he'd thought he'd learned to control. He stood there in the morning mist, holding a stranger's toy, and felt 20 years of carefully constructed walls threatening to crumble. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, to push the grief back down where it belonged. This wasn't about his daughter. This was about someone else's daughter, someone else's chance to grow up, to live, to have a future. He pocketed the toy horse and continued his observation. From his vantage point, he could see more of the camp's daily routine. The families emerged from their tents around sunrise, herded by guards to a communal area where they were fed a simple breakfast. The children stayed close to their parents, quiet and subdued. That wrong. Children should have been running, playing, making noise. These kids moved like small ghosts, trying not to be noticed. One little girl in particular caught his attention. She was perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair pulled back in braids. She kept looking around as if searching for something, and after a few minutes, Ezra realized she was looking for her toy horse. She tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered something. Her mother shook her head and pulled the girl close, and Ezra saw the woman's shoulders shake with what might have been silent crying. He looked down at the toy in his pocket. This was that girl's horse. She dropped it somehow, maybe while being moved from one area to another, and now she was grieving its loss. Ezra made a decision. He couldn't give it back to her yet, not without risking exposure. But he could keep it safe, and when the time came to rescue these families, he'd make sure she got her horse back. He settled in to continue watching. Around mid-morning, Victoria Blackwood emerged from her command tent. She was followed by Red Hand Morrison and another man Ezra didn't recognize, a thin fellow with a scar running down his left cheek. They walked to the mining area and spent time examining equipment. Checking progress, Ezra could hear some of what they said, their voices carrying on the morning air. "We're behind schedule," Victoria said, her tone sharp. "The eastern shaft should have been completed by now. The men are working as fast as they can, ma'am," Red Hand replied. "The rock is harder than expected at this depth, then work them in longer shifts. Double shifts if necessary. We need to extract everything we can in the next 2 weeks, and then we're done here. What about the families?" the scarred man asked. "What do we do with them when we're finished?" Victoria's response was too quiet for Ezra to hear, but the way both men reacted told him everything he needed to know. Red Hand nodded grimly, and the scarred man actually smiled, a cold, cruel expression that made Ezra's blood run cold. They were planning to kill the families. No question about it. Thomas Brennan had been right to be afraid. Ezra watched as the 3 of them continued their inspection, then returned to the command tent. He noted which tent it was, its position relative to everything else, the fact that it had guards posted at all times. Over the next several hours, he observed the work routine more carefully. The able-bodied men from the families were forced to work in the mines, digging and hauling ore. The women did cooking and laundry for the entire camp. The children were kept in the family area, watched by 1 or 2 guards who seemed bored with the duty. He also noticed something else. Not all the workers were from the families. There were about a dozen other men, rough types, who seemed to be there voluntarily, probably for pay. They worked alongside the coerced laborers, but stayed separate, eating at different times, sleeping in different tents. The distinction might be useful. If it came to a fight, some of those hired workers might run rather than risk their lives defending Victoria Blackwood's operation. Around noon, one of the families tried something desperate. A man, not Thomas Brennan, but another father Ezra had been watching, suddenly broke away from his work detail and ran toward the tree line. He was making a break for it, trying to escape. He didn't make it 50 yards before shots rang out. The man went down hard, clutching his leg. Guards converged on him immediately, hauling him to his feet and dragging him back to camp as he screamed in pain. Victoria Blackwood appeared within minutes. She stood over the wounded man, who was now lying in the dirt, his family clustered around him, crying and begging. "Bring everyone," Victoria ordered. "I want everyone to see this." The guards herded all the families together. The workers, too, and even some of the outlaws came to watch. Victoria waited until she had everyone's attention. "You all signed contracts," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "You agreed to work for a specified period of time. Some of you may feel that agreement was made under false pretenses, but that doesn't change the fact that you are legally bound to fulfill your obligations." She gestured to the wounded man. "This man attempted to break his contract. That cannot be tolerated. However, because I am not unreasonable, I'm going to allow him to recover from his wound and return to work." She paused, letting that sink in. "But if anyone else tries to leave before their contract is fulfilled, the consequences will be more severe." Do I make myself clear? There was a murmur of assent from the crowd. The wounded man was carried away to receive medical attention. The families returned to their quarters, and the workers went back to their tasks. Ezra felt rage burning in his chest. The casual brutality of it, the way Victoria Blackwood spoke of contracts and legal obligations while holding people hostage at gunpoint, it was monstrous. He watched until evening, memorizing more details, counting guard changes, noting which of the outlaws seemed more alert and which seemed lazy or drunk. All of this information would be crucial when the time came to act. As darkness fell, he carefully withdrew and made his way back toward his cabin. He was about halfway there when he heard horses coming up the trail behind him. He quickly moved off the path and hid in a thick stand of pine, watching as 3 riders passed by. He recognized one of them, Deputy Marshal Wade Garrett. The other 2 were strangers, hard-looking men wearing trail dust and carrying weapons like they knew how to use them. They were heading in the direction of the hidden valley. Reinforcements, Ezra realized. Victoria Blackwood was bringing in more guns, probably in response to the knowledge that someone had been snooping around. That made the situation even more dangerous, and the timeline even tighter. He waited until the riders were well past, then continued to his cabin. Once there, he lit a lamp and sat down at his table with his journal. He needed to document everything he'd seen today, but first, he pulled out the wooden toy horse and set it on the table in front of him. It sat there in the lamplight, that small carved horse with its uneven legs, and Ezra found himself unable to look away from it. It represented everything at stake here: innocence, childhood, the future. A little girl had loved this toy enough to carry it with her even in captivity. Someone, probably her father, had carved it with love and care. Ezra picked up his pen and began to write. But the words came slowly. His mind kept drifting to Emma, to Sarah, to the life he'd lost. He'd spent 20 years trying to escape that pain, trying to bury it under solitude and silence. But this toy horse, this simple wooden object, had cracked something open inside him. He'd failed to protect his own family. He'd been away when they needed him most, chasing outlaws through hostile territory, while fever burned through his home. He'd lived with that guilt every day since, wearing it like a stone around his neck. But maybe he could protect someone else's family. Maybe he could prevent another father from standing at a grave, hat in his hands, wondering why he hadn't been there. Ezra set down his pen and walked to the shelf where his father's revolver rested. He unwrapped it and held it in his hands, feeling the weight of it, remembering the last time he'd used it in anger. That had been more than 20 years ago, during his final mission as a scout, tracking a band of raiders who'd attacked a settlement and taken hostages. He'd killed 3 men that day, shot them without hesitation, without remorse, because they'd been threatening innocent lives. He'd thought he was done with that kind of violence. He'd thought he could leave it behind, along with everything else from his old life, but violence had a way of finding you, whether you wanted it or not. He loaded the revolver carefully, checking each chamber, making sure the mechanism was smooth. Then he did the same with his rifle. He checked his ammunition supply, enough for what needed to be done, but not much margin for error. Tomorrow he would meet with Samuel again. They would finalize their plan, and then they would act. Ezra returned to the table and picked up the toy horse again. He examined it more closely and noticed something he'd missed before. On the underside of the horse's belly, barely visible, someone had carved a name, Sarah. His breath caught. His wife's name. This child was named Sarah, just like his wife had been. The coincidence felt like a message, like some kind of sign from whatever powers governed the universe. He set the toy carefully on his shelf, next to his journal and his father's revolver. 3 objects now, 3 touchstones connecting him to past, present, and future. The journal represented his solitary years, his attempt to find peace in nature. The revolver represented his duty, the warrior he used to be. And the toy horse represented hope, the possibility of redemption, the chance to save something precious before it was destroyed. Ezra lay down on his bed, but knew sleep would be elusive. His mind was already moving ahead, planning, strategizing, preparing for what was to come. 2 days, Samuel had said. 2 days to gather information, to prepare, to make ready. 2 days before he stepped back into the world of violence he'd tried so hard to leave behind. But this time, it would be different. This time, he wasn't fighting for glory or duty or country. He was fighting for something simpler and more profound. For children who deserved to play with their toys, for families who deserved to stay together, for innocent people who'd been trapped by circumstances beyond their control. He was fighting for the chance to do what he'd failed to do 20 years ago, protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. In the distance, thunder rumbled, the promised storm finally arriving. Ezra listened to the rain begin, a soft patter that gradually increased to a steady drumming on the roof. The rain would make surveillance more difficult tomorrow, but it might also provide cover. Everything was a trade-off now. Every decision weighted with consequence. He couldn't afford mistakes. Those families, Thomas Brennan and his daughter, the little girl named Sarah who'd lost her horse, all of them, they were counting on him whether they knew it or not. Ezra closed his eyes and tried to rest, knowing that the days ahead would test him in ways he hadn't been tested in 20 years. He was an old man now, rusty and slow. But he still had his mind, his experience, and most importantly, his determination. He would not fail these families the way he'd failed his own. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would see them safely away from that hidden valley. The toy horse sat on his shelf, a small wooden reminder of everything at stake. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The rain continued through the night and into the next morning, turning the forest trails into muddy streams. Ezra used the weather as cover, approaching the hidden valley from yet another angle. This time from the south, where the terrain was steeper and less likely to be patrolled. The rain made observation difficult, but it also made the guards less vigilant. They huddled under overhangs and in tents, venturing out only when necessary. Ezra was able to get closer than he dared before, close enough to overhear conversations, close enough to see details he'd missed on previous visits. He spent most of the morning watching the mining operation itself. The workers hauled ore from deep inside the mountain, emerging from dark tunnel mouths with carts full of the dark metallic material Victoria Blackwood seemed so interested in. The ore was taken to a processing area where it was sorted, crushed, and packed into wooden crates lined with straw. During a brief lull in the rain, Ezra managed to work his way around to the western side of the camp, to an area he hadn't been able to observe closely before. What he found there made his stomach turn. There was a section of forest where the earth had been recently disturbed. Several mounds of fresh dirt arranged in rows. They were the wrong size to be refuse pits. They were graves. Ezra counted 7 of them. 7 people who died in this camp or been killed here, and been buried in unmarked graves far from anyone who might ask questions. He thought about Thomas Brennan's words. People who cause trouble disappear, rumored to be buried in the old mine shafts. Maybe some were in the mine shafts. But some were here, in this hidden cemetery. The rage he'd been feeling crystallized into something colder, harder. This wasn't just about illegal mining or corporate greed. This was murder. Victoria Blackwood and her people had killed at least 7 times that he could prove, and probably more. He was memorizing the exact location of the graves, evidence that would be crucial later when he heard someone approaching. He melted back into the trees just as 2 men emerged from the camp. One was the scarred man he'd seen with Victoria and Red Hand. The other was a younger fellow, maybe 30, with the nervous energy of someone who talked too much. They were carrying shovels. "I don't like this part of the job," the younger man was saying. "Makes me nervous." "Just shut up and dig where you're told," the scarred man replied. "Miss Blackwood pays good money. You want to keep getting paid, you do what's asked." "Yeah, but when the law finally comes asking questions, the law ain't coming. Garrett's in our pocket, and by the time anyone else notices something wrong, we'll be long gone with enough money to disappear proper-like." They stopped near the graves, and the scarred man paced out a measurement from the last mound. "Here, dig it about 6 feet long, 4 feet deep. We'll need it ready by tomorrow." The younger man started digging, and the scarred man stood watching him, smoking a cigarette. After a few minutes, the younger man paused. "Who's this one for?" "That fellow who tried to run yesterday. Miss Blackwood says he won't make it through the night. Lost too much blood. We'll bury him tomorrow afternoon." Ezra's hands clenched into fists. The wounded man was dying, and they were already preparing his grave. These people had no conscience, no mercy. The 2 men continued their grim work, and Ezra stayed hidden, watching, listening, learning. After about an hour, they finished digging and returned to camp, leaving behind the fresh hole, waiting for its occupant. Ezra remained in position for another hour, making sure no one else was coming, then worked his way back around to the family area. He needed to see if the wounded man was really dying, or if that was just the scarred man's assumption. From a concealed position, he could see the family tents. There was activity around one of them, people going in and out carrying water and bandages. A woman stood outside the tent, her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Children huddled nearby, frightened and quiet. The wounded man's family, Ezra realized, they were watching him die. He wanted desperately to do something, to help somehow, but he couldn't risk exposing himself. Not yet. If he revealed his presence now, Victoria Blackwood might accelerate her timeline, might decide to eliminate all the witnesses immediately. He had to trust that Samuel was preparing for their meeting tomorrow, had to trust that they could act soon enough to save the rest of the families, even if they couldn't save this one man. The thought sat bitter in his throat. As afternoon wore into evening, Ezra made a careful circuit of the entire valley, noting everything he could. He found something interesting near the northern edge of the camp, a cache hidden under a tarp. It tucked back in the trees where casual observers wouldn't notice it. He waited until the nearest guard made his rounds and moved away, then quickly investigated. Under the tarp were wooden crates, and when he carefully pried one open, he found documents inside, maps, survey reports, letters, legal documents. Working quickly, Ezra examined what he could, committing key details to memory. The papers confirmed what Samuel had suspected. Victoria Blackwood was working for a mining consortium with connections to powerful men back east. The ore they were extracting was something called rare earth minerals, valuable for industrial and military applications. There were survey maps showing the extent of the mineral deposits. They were massive, worth millions if properly exploited. But the land was public territory, not yet officially open for mining claims. Victoria's operation was completely illegal. She was extracting the ore before the government could step in and regulate it. One letter, dated just 2 weeks ago, was particularly damning. It was from someone named Harrison Blackwell, apparently a financier in Chicago. The letter discussed profit, projections, and reminded Victoria that all evidence of the operation must be eliminated before the spring thaw, when government surveyors are scheduled to arrive. All evidence clearly included the families who'd been coerced into working here. Ezra carefully closed the crate and replaced the tarp exactly as he'd found it. This was the evidence Samuel would need, proof of conspiracy that reached all the way to Chicago. But getting these documents out would be difficult. The crate was too heavy to carry, and he couldn't risk making multiple trips. He'd have to tell Samuel about the location and let the ranger figure out how to secure the evidence once the families were safe. As darkness fell, Ezra made his way out of the valley and back toward his cabin. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, making the night particularly dark. Good for concealment, but also dangerous for movement through unfamiliar terrain. He was perhaps a mile from his cabin when he heard voices ahead. He immediately went to ground, listening. "Don't see why we got to patrol way out here," someone was saying. "If there's some old mountain man poking around, let him. What's he going to do?" "Miss Blackwood says he's dangerous," another voice replied. "Says he's probably ex-military, knows how to fight. We find him, we're supposed to bring him back to camp for questioning, and if he don't want to come, then we shoot him and drag his body back. She wants to know who he is and whether he's told anyone else about the valley." Ezra froze. There were at least 2 of them, maybe more, and they were specifically hunting for him. He'd underestimated how seriously Victoria Blackwood was taking the threat. She'd sent out armed patrols to find him. He stayed perfectly still as the men passed within 20 feet of his position. They were moving clumsily, talking too loud, making enough noise to warn off every animal in the forest. They weren't skilled trackers, which was in his favor, but they were armed and determined. After they passed, Ezra waited a full 10 minutes before moving again. He took a circuitous route back to his cabin, making sure he wasn't followed, checking his back trail repeatedly. When he finally reached his cabin, he didn't light a lamp. Instead, he sat in the darkness and thought about what this new development meant. Victoria Blackwood knew someone was watching. She'd sent out patrols to find that someone. The element of surprise was evaporating. He and Samuel would need to act soon, very soon. Maybe as soon as tomorrow night. Ezra allowed himself a few hours of uneasy sleep, rising again before dawn. He needed to get to Pinewood, to meet with Samuel and adjust their plans based on this new intelligence. The ride to town was nerve-wracking. He kept expecting to encounter more patrols, but the forest remained quiet. Either he'd gotten lucky, or the patrols were concentrating their search in a different area. He reached Pinewood just after sunrise. Samuel's store didn't open for another hour, so Ezra waited in the stable, making sure his horse was comfortable and watching the street for any sign of trouble. When Samuel finally arrived and unlocked the store, Ezra slipped in behind him. Samuel took one look at his face and immediately locked the door again and pulled the shades. "What happened?" he asked. Ezra told him everything. The graves, the dying man, the hidden cache of documents, the armed patrols, Victoria Blackwood's order to find and capture him. Samuel listened without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When Ezra finished, the ranger paced behind his counter, thinking hard. "This changes things," he said finally. "We can't wait. If they're actively hunting for you, it's only a matter of time before they find your cabin or catch you in the open. And if they do, they'll know something's wrong, and they'll probably kill those families immediately to eliminate the witnesses." "I know," Ezra said. "We need to move tonight." "Tonight," Samuel agreed. He went to his locked drawer and pulled out his ranger badge, pinning it to his vest. "No more hiding. This is official business now." He pulled out a second revolver and a shotgun, along with boxes of ammunition. "I sent a coded telegram to my captain yesterday. Rangers are on their way, but they won't arrive for another 2 days at minimum. We'll have to hold out until then. The plan? Ezra asked. Samuel unrolled a map on the counter, the same one they'd marked up during their first planning session, now annotated with additional details Ezra had provided. We can't take on 40 armed men directly, so we divide the problem. First, we evacuate the families. Second, we deal with Victoria Blackwood and her people. Evacuate how? There's an old mining tunnel system on the northern edge of that valley. You mentioned seeing old tunnel entrances. Those mines were abandoned 20 years ago, but I've been in them. They connect to a network that eventually comes out near Silver Creek. The families can escape through the tunnels while we create a diversion. Ezra studied the map. That's 3 miles through abandoned tunnels. In the dark, with children, I know. But it's the only way to get them out without fighting through 40 armed men. Samuel traced the route with his finger. You'll lead them through. I'll stay above ground and keep Victoria's people busy. Once you get the families into the tunnels, you seal the entrance behind you. Even if they realize what's happening, they won't be able to follow quickly. What about you? I'm a Texas Ranger. I've got authority to arrest Victoria Blackwood and everyone working for her. I'll try to do it legal-like, but if they resist, he patted his revolver. I'll do what needs doing. 1 man against 40 isn't arrest. It's suicide, Samuel smiled grimly. Won't be 40 for long. Those hired workers, the ones who aren't outlaws, they'll run when shooting starts. And some of the outlaws will too. Red Hand Morrison and a handful of true believers, that's who I'll really be facing. I can handle that until the Rangers arrive. Ezra wasn't convinced, but he knew Samuel was right about one thing. There was no perfect plan. They had to work with what they had. They spent the next several hours preparing. Samuel provided Ezra with supplies for the families: rope, lanterns, food, water, warm blankets. He also gave him a map of the tunnel system marked with the safest route. Memorize this, Samuel said. You can't carry a light the whole way. Too easy to see from behind. You'll need to navigate some sections in total darkness. Ezra studied the map until he had it committed to memory, then burned it in Samuel's stove. No point in leaving evidence around. As they finalized details, Samuel pulled out something else from his locked drawer, a silver Texas Ranger badge, smaller than the one he wore. This is a Deputy Ranger badge. It gives you legal authority to act in support of my arrest warrant. Pin it on. Ezra took the badge and looked at it. 20 years ago, he'd worn a cavalry scout's insignia. Now he was being deputized as a ranger. Life had a strange way of circling back on itself. He pinned the badge inside his vest, where it wouldn't be visible, but could be produced if necessary. Tonight, Samuel said. Midnight. You go in quiet, find the families, get them into those tunnels. I'll create the diversion at the opposite end of camp. When you hear shooting, you'll know I've started. That's your signal to move, and if something goes wrong, then we improvise. Samuel extended his hand. May God be with us both. They shook hands, and Ezra felt the weight of what they were about to attempt settle on his shoulders. In less than 12 hours, everything would change. Either they'd save those families, or they'd die trying. There was no middle ground. Ezra left the store by the back door, not wanting to be seen leaving. He rode back toward his cabin, but didn't go all the way there. Instead, he cached his supplies in a location between his cabin and the hidden valley, a spot where he could access them quickly tonight. Then he found a concealed position overlooking the valley and settled in to wait for darkness, watching the camp, memorizing final details, preparing his mind for what was coming. The toy horse was in his pocket. He'd carry it with him into the tunnels, and when little Sarah was safe, he'd return it to her. That would be his promise kept, his small act of redemption in a world that had taken so much from him. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Ezra checked his weapons one more time, made sure he had everything he needed, and whispered a prayer, the first prayer he'd spoken in 20 years, for the strength to see this through. Tonight, the reckoning would begin. When Ezra emerged from the tunnel entrance, dawn was breaking over the mountains. The blocked entrance had been partially cleared. Victoria's men had been through here, but they hadn't pursued into the tunnels. Smart of them, he thought. The tunnel system was a maze, and they'd known they could get lost or trapped. He moved cautiously toward the camp, using every bit of cover available. As he got closer, he could hear voices, but no more gunfire. That could be good or bad. From a concealed position on the ridge overlooking the valley, Ezra surveyed the scene below. The camp was in disarray. Several tents had been burned. Supply crates were scattered everywhere. But the thing that caught his attention most was the group of men standing in the center of camp, hands raised in surrender and facing them. Looking remarkably calm despite being outnumbered was Samuel, except Samuel wasn't alone. There were 5 other men with him, all wearing ranger badges, all armed. The cavalry, or in this case, the Texas Rangers, had arrived early. Ezra felt relief wash over him like a wave. Samuel had held out long enough. The reinforcements had come. He made his way down into the valley, emerging from the tree line with his hands visible, not wanting to be mistaken for a threat. One of the rangers spotted him and raised his rifle, but Samuel called out, "Hold fire! He's with me." Ezra walked into the camp, taking in the scene. Victoria Blackwood stood among the prisoners, her face pale but composed. Red Hand Morrison was there too, looking murderous. The scarred man and about a dozen others, all disarmed and under guard. Samuel came over to meet him, and Ezra saw that the ranger was wounded. His left arm was bandaged and hung in a makeshift sling, and there was dried blood on his vest. "You're hurt," Ezra said, "just a graze." "I've had worse," Samuel grinned. "The families?" "Safe, on their way to Silver Creek, all 17 of them." Samuel's expression showed profound relief. "Thank God. I wasn't sure. When the shooting started, everything went to chaos. I thought I might have gotten you all killed. Your diversion worked perfectly. Gave us the time we needed." Ezra looked around at the Rangers. "How did they get here so fast?" "You said 2 days minimum." "That's what I need to explain," Samuel said. He gestured toward the Rangers' captain, a tall man with gray hair and a weathered face. "Captain, this is Ezra Cole, the man I told you about." The captain extended his hand. "James Mitchell. Sam sent word 3 days ago, not 2. He was worried about the timeline and wanted us in position early. We were camped about 5 miles from here when the shooting started." Ezra looked at Samuel with new understanding. "You planned this. You knew we couldn't wait for official backup, but you made sure they'd be close enough to help anyway." "I'm a ranger," Samuel said simply. "Planning for contingencies is what we do." One of the other rangers approached. "Captain, we've secured all the prisoners." "What about the mine itself? Should we—" He was interrupted by a shout from across the camp. "Captain! You need to see this." Everyone turned. A ranger was standing near the entrance to Victoria's command tent, holding up something that gleamed in the morning light. A silver Texas Ranger badge. But not just any badge. This one looked older, tarnished, with a specific number etched into it. Captain Mitchell's face went white when he saw it. "Where did you find that?" he demanded. "In her tent, sir, hidden in a locked box." The captain turned to Victoria Blackwood, and Ezra saw something he hadn't expected to see: recognition. "These two knew each other. Badge number 47, the captain said quietly. "That belonged to Ranger William Blackwood, my friend." "Your husband," Victoria's composed expression finally cracked. "You have no right to speak his name. Your husband died 5 years ago," the captain continued, his voice hard. "Shot in the back during a raid on an outlaw camp. We never found out who killed him, but we always suspected it was an inside job. Someone who knew the raid was coming." Samuel stepped forward. "Captain, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that William Blackwood was investigating a corruption ring 5 years ago. Mining interests paying off law enforcement, criminal syndicates moving in on public land. He was getting close to exposing it when he died." Captain Mitchell looked at Victoria. "And his widow inherited his estate, suddenly had access to information she shouldn't have had, and shortly after started working for the very mining consortium her husband was investigating." Victoria remained silent, but her eyes burned with something dark and defiant. The captain turned to his rangers. "Search everything. I want every document, every piece of correspondence, everything she's been hiding. This goes deeper than illegal mining." As the rangers began their search, Samuel pulled Ezra aside. "I didn't know about her husband being a ranger. I knew he was military, but—" "It explains a lot," Ezra said. "She's not just a criminal. She's someone with a personal grudge against the law, against the system that got her husband killed. Over the next hour, the Rangers methodically searched the camp. They found the cache of documents Ezra had discovered, confirming the connection to the Chicago Consortium. They found the graves and began the grim work of exhuming them for evidence. They found detailed records Victoria had kept of everything: payments, shipments, orders, correspondence with powerful men back east. It was a treasure trove of evidence that would bring down not just this operation, but the entire network behind it. But the most damning discovery came when the Rangers searched the mining tunnels themselves. Deep inside, past the areas where the ore had been extracted, they found something else, a section of tunnel that had been deliberately collapsed, with fresh timbers sealing it off. When they broke through, they found bodies. Not 7, as Ezra had counted in the graves, but 23. Men, women, even a few children. All of them had been killed execution-style and buried in the mountain itself. The horror of it silenced everyone. Even the hardened Rangers looked shaken. How long has this operation been running? Captain Mitchell asked Victoria. She didn't answer. "We can make this easier on you," the captain said. "Cooperate, tell us everything, and maybe the judge will show mercy." Victoria laughed, a bitter sound. "Mercy? The same mercy the law showed my husband. He tried to be an honest ranger, tried to fight corruption from within, and it got him killed by the very people he trusted." She looked around at the assembled lawmen. "This system is rotten to its core. I just learned how to profit from the rot." "Your husband would be ashamed," Captain Mitchell said quietly. That struck home. Victoria's face twisted with rage and grief. "My husband was a fool. He believed in justice, in honor, in the law. And where did it get him? A bullet in the back and a pauper's grave. So you decided to dishonor his memory by becoming everything he fought against," the captain said. "By murdering innocent people, by trafficking in human misery. That's your tribute to him?" Victoria turned away, refusing to speak further, as the Rangers began the process of transporting prisoners and securing evidence. Samuel and Ezra found themselves standing together near the edge of camp, looking out over the valley that had held so many secrets. "It's over," Samuel said. "Thanks to you. Thanks to both of us," Ezra corrected. "I couldn't have done this alone." Samuel pulled something from his pocket, the deputy ranger badge he'd given Ezra yesterday. "You should keep this. You've earned it. I'm not a lawman, maybe not officially, but you did a lawman's work. You protected the innocent and brought criminals to justice. That's what matters." Samuel pressed the badge into Ezra's hand. "Besides, you never know. Might need to deputize you again sometime." Ezra looked at the silver badge, felt its weight. It was similar to his father's cavalry insignia, similar to the scout's credentials he'd once carried. Another symbol of duty, of responsibility, of standing up when standing up was needed. He pocketed it. "If you ever need help again, you know where to find me." "The Lonely Mountain Man, 3 hours northwest of Pinewood," Samuel said with a slight smile. "Living in a cabin and preferring solitude. Maybe not as much solitude as before," Ezra admitted. "Turns out 20 years alone was enough. Maybe it's time I rejoined the world a bit." Captain Mitchell approached them. "Frost Cole, I need your statements. Everything from the beginning. This is going to be a long investigation, and I want every detail documented." They spent the rest of the morning going over everything, telling the Rangers about the surveillance, the rescue, the tunnel escape. Every piece of information they'd gathered. Other Rangers were dispatched to Silver Creek to take statements from the rescued families. By afternoon, the prisoners were being prepared for transport. Victoria Blackwood would face trial for multiple murders. Red Hand Morrison and the other outlaws would hang. Deputy Marshal Wade Garrett had fled during the chaos, but wouldn't get far. Rangers were already on his trail. The mining operation itself would be shut down. The land secured until the government decided what to do with it. The ore that had been extracted would be confiscated as evidence. The consortium members in Chicago would face investigation and prosecution. It was, Samuel told Ezra, the biggest criminal case the territory had seen in a decade. As the sun began to set, the prisoners were finally loaded into wagons for the journey to Silver Creek and the territorial prison beyond. Victoria Blackwood sat in one of the wagons, her hands shackled, staring straight ahead with empty eyes. Ezra watched her and felt something unexpected, not triumph, but sadness. She'd lost her husband to violence and corruption, and instead of working to make things better, she'd let bitterness turn her into a monster. How many people had died because of her need for revenge and profit? 23 in the tunnels, 7 in the graves. The man who'd been shot trying to escape, and who knew how many others over the months this operation had been running. All that death because one woman chose hatred over healing. "You look thoughtful," Samuel said, joining him. "Just thinking about how easy it is to become the thing you hate," Ezra replied. She blamed corruption for killing her husband, so she became corrupt herself. Probably justified it somehow, telling herself she was just playing the same game everyone else was playing. "That's the danger," Samuel agreed. "When you fight monsters, you have to be careful not to become one." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the wagons roll out. "What will you do now?" Samuel asked. "Go back to my cabin, I suppose. Tend to things. Maybe come into town more often than once a month." Ezra smiled slightly. "What about you?" "Back to rangering. Captain wants me to stay in Pinewood, keep running the store as a cover. Turns out there's more corruption in this territory than we thought, and having a ranger embedded in the community will be useful." Samuel extended his hand. "So I guess we'll be neighbors for a while yet." They shook hands, and Ezra felt grateful for this unexpected friendship. He'd spent 20 years avoiding human connection, and now he'd found it in the most unlikely of circumstances, in the middle of a criminal conspiracy, surrounded by danger, fighting for the lives of strangers. Maybe that's how real connections were forged. Not in comfortable circumstances, but in hard ones. Not when life was easy, but when it demanded everything you had. As darkness fell, Ezra made his way back toward his cabin. He was exhausted, wounded in a few places he hadn't even noticed until now, and probably too old to have done what he'd just done, but he'd done it anyway. And 17 people were alive because of it. That had to count for something. 3 days after the rescue, Ezra received an unexpected visit at his cabin. He was sitting on his porch, cleaning his rifle and enjoying the morning sun, when he heard horses approaching. His hand moved instinctively toward his revolver, but he relaxed when he recognized Samuel riding at the head of a small group. With Samuel were Captain Mitchell and Thomas Brennan. The 3 men dismounted and Ezra stood to greet them. "Didn't expect company," Ezra said. "Especially not this much of it. We need to talk," Samuel said, and something in his tone made Ezra's instincts sharpen. They went inside, and Ezra put coffee on to boil. The men sat around his small table, and he noticed they all looked grim. "The families are safe?" he asked, suddenly worried. "They're fine," Captain Mitchell assured him. "Settled in Silver Creek under ranger protection until the trials are over." "That's not why we're here. Then what?" The captain pulled out a document and laid it on the table. It was a map, but not of the local territory. This showed a much larger area, stretching across multiple territories and states, with dozens of locations marked in red ink. "While investigating Victoria Blackwood's operation, we discovered something troubling," the captain said. "Her mining consortium isn't just active here. They have similar operations running in at least 15 other locations across the West, all of them using the same methods: coerced labor, murdered witnesses, corrupt local law enforcement." Ezra studied the map, feeling cold dread settle in his stomach. "How many people?" "We don't know for certain. But based on what we found here and extrapolating to the other sites," the captain paused, "hundreds, maybe more than 1,000 people have been caught up in these operations over the past 3 years. The scale of it was staggering. What they'd stopped here was just one small piece of something much larger, much more organized. We're moving on all the locations simultaneously," the captain continued, "coordinating with ranger companies and federal marshals across 6 territories. But we have a problem." He tapped one location on the map, deep in the mountains of New Mexico. "This one," Samuel leaned forward. "The operation there is the largest. According to the documents we found, it's where they've been refining most of the ore, preparing it for shipment east. It's also where the consortium's leadership is based. If we can take that location, we cut the head off the snake. So take it, Ezra said. You have the resources. It's not that simple, Captain Mitchell replied. The location is a fortress. Natural canyon walls on 3 sides, only one approach, heavily guarded. They have at least 50 armed men, maybe more. And they've been there for over a year, so they're well supplied, well prepared. A direct assault would be costly, Samuel added. We'd lose a lot of rangers, and there's no guarantee we'd win. Plus they have hostages, families like the ones here. If we attack head-on, those people die. Ezra was beginning to understand where this was going. You want me to help? We need someone who knows how to scout hostile territory, who can move unseen, who can gather intelligence on their defenses, the captain said. Someone who's done this kind of work before. 20 years ago, I did this kind of work. I'm an old man now. You rescued 17 people from an armed camp 3 nights ago, Samuel pointed out. You don't strike me as too old for anything. Thomas Brennan spoke for the first time. Mr. Cole, you saved my family. You saved all our families, but there are others still trapped, still being forced to work, still waiting to die when they're no longer useful. He looked directly at Ezra. I'm asking you to help them, the way you helped us. Ezra looked at the 3 men, then down at the map. The New Mexico location was marked with multiple notations, guard positions, supply routes, known casualties. Someone had already done preliminary reconnaissance, but they needed more. They needed someone who could get close, who could see things others might miss. He thought about the graves they'd found in the hidden valley. 23 people murdered and buried in darkness. If this New Mexico operation was larger, how many graves would they find there? How many families would be destroyed if they did nothing? He thought about his daughter Emma, about the toy horse he'd returned to little Sarah. He thought about his wife Sarah, who'd always believed in standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. And he thought about his father's words, inscribed on the revolver that now rested on his shelf. Use it to protect those who can't protect themselves. When do we leave? He asked quietly. Relief showed on all 3 faces. Captain Mitchell smiled. Tomorrow morning. We have rangers assembling in Santa Fe. From there, it's a 3-day ride to the target. You'll travel with Samuel's team. 5 rangers total. Your job is reconnaissance only. Get in, map their defenses, identify where the hostages are being kept, find their weaknesses. Then get out and report back. And if I can't get out, then we come in anyway, but with less information and more risk. The captain's expression was serious. I won't lie to you, Cole. This is dangerous. More dangerous than what you did here. These people know we're coming now. They'll be watching for scouts, for spies. If they catch you, I know what happens if they catch me, Ezra said. He'd been captured once during his scouting days, had spent 3 days as a Comanche prisoner before managing to escape. The scars on his back were a permanent reminder of that experience. I'll be careful. They spent the next hour going over what intelligence they already had. The New Mexico operation was run by a man named Silas Cord, a former Army officer cashiered out for corruption. He was smart, ruthless, and paranoid, a dangerous combination. The canyon fortress he'd chosen was nearly impregnable from a military standpoint, but Ezra had learned long ago that no position was truly impregnable. Every fortress had weaknesses, every defense had gaps. You just had to be patient and observant enough to find them. That evening, after the others had left, Ezra began his preparations. He went through his equipment methodically, repairing anything that showed wear, replacing anything that might fail at a crucial moment. He cleaned his weapons again, checked his ammunition, organized his supplies into easily carried bundles. He also spent time with his journal, updating it with everything that had happened over the past week. If something went wrong in New Mexico, if he didn't come back, he wanted there to be a record. He wanted people to know what had been attempted and why. On the last page, he wrote a note addressed to no one in particular. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. Don't mourn too long. I've had a good life, longer than I deserved, and if it ends trying to help people who need helping, that's a death I can accept. The next morning, Samuel arrived with 4 other rangers. Ezra recognized one of them, the young ranger who'd found Victoria Blackwood's badge. The others were strangers, but they had the look of experienced men, comfortable with their weapons and their purpose. "This is Sergeant Hayes." Samuel introduced a grizzled man with a scarred face. "He'll be in tactical command. I'm along as the official ranger liaison." Hayes shook Ezra's hand. His grip was firm, his eyes assessing. "Frost says you're the best scout he's ever met." "High praise from a Texas ranger." "Frost exaggerates," Ezra said. "We'll see," Hayes replied, but there was no challenge in his voice. Just professional evaluation. They rode out shortly after dawn, heading south. The journey to Santa Fe took 2 days of hard riding. They traveled light and fast, stopping only when necessary, pushing their horses but not breaking them. Ezra fell naturally into the rhythm of it. Despite his 20 years away from this life, the skills came back like muscle memory. Reading terrain, identifying good camping spots, watching for signs of pursuit or ambush. The rangers noticed and seemed to relax around him, accepting him as one of their own. In Santa Fe, they met with Captain Mitchell and the assembled strike force, 20 rangers from various companies, plus a handful of federal marshals. The captain briefed everyone on the overall plan. Simultaneous raids on all 15 consortium locations, coordinated to happen within a 48-hour window to prevent word spreading. "The New Mexico site is critical," the captain explained. "Take it and we break the organization's back. Fail, and they'll scatter, disappear, and start up somewhere else within a year." He looked directly at Ezra. "Which is why we need perfect intelligence. Cole, you'll have 5 days to scout the canyon and report back. That's our window. Any longer, and we risk them changing their defenses or moving the hostages. 5 days. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. They left Santa Fe that same evening, wanting to cover ground while it was cool. The terrain gradually changed as they traveled, becoming more arid, more mountainous. This was harsh country, beautiful in its own way, but unforgiving of mistakes. On the 3rd day, they reached a ranger camp about 10 miles from the target canyon. This would be their base of operations. Hayes laid out the plan. "Cole, you go in alone. Less chance of detection that way. You'll have 4 days to observe and map. On the 5th day, you pull out to this rally point." He marked a spot on the map. "We'll be waiting there. Then we plan our assault based on what you've learned." "What if I'm not at the rally point on day 5? Ezra asked. "Then we assume you've been captured or killed, and we attack anyway with what intelligence we have." Hayes met his eyes. "I don't like sending a man in alone, but it's our best chance." "Can you do this?" Ezra thought about Thomas Brennan's words, about the families still trapped, about the graves they'd find if they arrived too late. "I can do it," he said. That night, Ezra made his final preparations. He stripped his equipment down to absolute essentials: weapons, ammunition, water, a little dried food, basic survival gear. No lantern, nothing that could give him away. He'd be traveling by starlight and instinct. Samuel found him checking his gear one last time. "I wish I was going with you. You're more valuable here, helping Hayes plan the assault." Ezra looked at his friend. "If I don't make it back, you'll make it back. But if I don't, make sure those families are taken care of. The ones here and the ones in New Mexico. They've been through enough. They deserve peace. You have my word." They clasped hands, and Ezra saw genuine concern in Samuel's eyes. They'd known each other less than 2 weeks, but they'd been through enough together to forge a bond deeper than most men built in a lifetime. "Be careful out there," Samuel said. "These people are more dangerous than Victoria Blackwood's gang. They're organized, well-funded, and they've been doing this longer. I know. But I've scouted worse in my day, when you were 20 years younger." "Age brings wisdom," Ezra said with a slight smile. "I might be slower, but I'm smarter about it." At first light, Ezra set out alone. He carried his rifle, his father's revolver, his knife, and the bare minimum of supplies. The canyon was 6 hours away on foot if he took a direct route, but he didn't take a direct route. Instead, he circled wide, approaching from an unexpected direction, taking his time, making certain he left no trail that could be followed. As he walked, He thought about the journey that had brought him here. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a hermit living in peaceful solitude, bothering no one, asking nothing of the world. Now he was walking into hostile territory, preparing to risk his life for people he'd never met. How had this happened? But he knew the answer. It had happened because he'd looked through a gap in the forest and seen something wrong, because he'd chosen to care. Because he'd decided that some things mattered more than safety and comfort and peace. 20 years ago, he'd run away from the world because it had hurt him too much. Now he was running toward danger, toward trouble, toward a fight he might not win, and somehow that felt right. That felt like coming home to himself, to the man he'd been before grief had broken him. As the sun reached its zenith, Ezra caught his first glimpse of the canyon in the distance. Even from miles away, he could see why it was considered a fortress. Sheer rock walls rising hundreds of feet, a narrow entrance that could be easily defended, natural lookout points where guards could see anyone approaching long before they arrived. He spent the rest of that first day circling the canyon at a distance, studying it from every angle, looking for alternatives to the obvious front entrance. By nightfall, he'd identified 3 possibilities: a narrow cleft on the eastern wall that might be climbable, a dried stream bed that ran under the northern wall where water had once carved a passage, and what looked like an old mining trail on the western ridge. He made camp that night in a hidden depression among the rocks, no fire, just cold water and dried meat. The stars above were brilliant, untouched by any civilization's light. He lay on his back and looked up at them, remembering nights like this during his scouting days, before Sarah and Emma, before grief and loss had reshaped his life. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. He woke before dawn and made his approach to the eastern cleft. It took him 3 hours of careful climbing, testing each handhold, moving in silence. Twice, he had to freeze in place as guards passed on the canyon rim above him, their voices carrying clearly in the still morning air. When he finally reached a position where he could see into the canyon, what he saw made his heart sink. The operation here was massive, easily 100 people visible, maybe more. Multiple mine entrances, processing facilities, barracks-style housing, and everywhere armed guards. Not the casual, lazy guards he'd seen at Victoria Blackwood's camp, but professional sentries who knew their business. He spent 6 hours in that position, barely moving, taking mental notes of everything. Guard rotations every 4 hours. Supply wagons coming and going through the main entrance. Work crews being marched to and from the mines at regular intervals. And then he saw the families. They were housed in a separate section, away from the main work areas. From his vantage point, Ezra counted at least 40 people in that section. Men, women, children. They moved like prisoners, heads down, always watched. He committed every detail to memory. The location of the family quarters, the number of guards assigned to watch them, the route they took to and from the work sites. All of it would be crucial for planning a rescue. As darkness fell, he carefully withdrew and made his way to the second potential entry point, the dried stream bed. It took most of the night to work his way around to the northern side of the canyon and locate the passage he'd spotted from a distance. The stream bed did run under the wall, but only for about 20 feet before it opened into the canyon. The problem was that it emptied directly into the main work area. Anyone using it as an entry point would be immediately visible to dozens of workers and guards. Not viable. That left the western ridge and the old mining trail. By dawn of the second day, Ezra was in position to examine the western approach. The trail had been carved into the rock face decades ago, probably by prospectors working claims before the area had been taken over. It was barely visible now, overgrown and crumbling in places, but it was there. And more importantly, it led to a section of the canyon rim that was less heavily guarded. The terrain there was too steep for easy access, so Silas Cord's men had concentrated their defenses elsewhere. This was the weakness Ezra had been looking for. He spent the second day studying that approach in detail, noting where the trail was most dangerous, where it could be easily blocked if defenders realized it was being used. He also took careful note of the time it would take to climb. At least 2 hours for a skilled climber, probably 3 for soldiers carrying weapons and equipment. On the third day, he got closer to the main camp than he dared before. Moving during shift changes when there was maximum confusion, he worked his way to within 50 yards of the family quarters. From there, behind a stack of supply crates, he could hear conversations. A woman was crying, talking to another woman about her daughter who'd gotten sick from the mine dust. A man was arguing with a guard, begging for better food for the children. The guard laughed and walked away, Ezra's hands clenched into fists. The casual cruelty of it, the systematic dehumanization of these people, it brought back all his rage from the hidden valley. These guards, these men who worked for Silas Cord, they'd become monsters without even realizing it. They'd convinced themselves that these families were somehow less than human, that their suffering didn't matter. He wanted to act immediately, to do something. But he forced himself to wait, to observe, to gather information. That was his mission. Rescue would come later, but only if he did his job properly now. On the fourth day, he finally saw Silas Cord himself. The man emerged from a large structure built against the canyon wall. His headquarters, presumably. He was in his 50s, tall and straight-backed despite his age, with the bearing of a career military officer. He moved through the camp with authority, inspecting operations, questioning foremen, checking on progress. Ezra studied him carefully. This was the man Hayes would need to target during the assault. Take down Cord, and his organization would likely fall apart. But Cord was well protected, always surrounded by at least 4 guards, never exposing himself to potential danger. That evening, Ezra witnessed something that changed his understanding of the situation. A work crew came back from the mines, exhausted and stumbling. One man collapsed, unable to go further. The guards dragged him aside, and Ezra watched as they carried him not to the medical tent, but toward a section of the canyon he hadn't been able to observe closely. He followed at a distance, moving through shadows, taking enormous risks to see where they were taking the man. What he discovered made his blood run cold. There was another section of the canyon, hidden behind a rock outcrop where they dug mass graves, not carefully concealed graves like at the hidden valley. These were open pits, dozens of bodies visible even in the fading light. The guards threw the unconscious man into one of the pits, and Ezra heard him cry out weakly. They were burying people alive if they couldn't work anymore. He'd seen death before, had dealt death when necessary during his scouting days and his years in the cavalry. But this was systematic murder on a scale he'd never encountered. This was industrial efficiency applied to human slaughter. He had to warn Hayes, had to make sure the Rangers understood what they were facing. This wasn't just about stopping an illegal mining operation. This was about stopping a massacre that was already well underway. On the 5th day, Ezra began his withdrawal. He'd seen everything he needed to see, had mapped the defenses in his mind, had identified the weak points and the dangers. Now he needed to get this information to Hayes before time ran out. He chose to exit via the eastern cleft, the same way he'd first entered. It was treacherous climbing down, but it was the route he knew best. He was halfway down when he heard shouting above. They'd spotted him. Ezra moved faster, taking risks, skipping handholds he should have tested. Bullets started pinging off the rocks around him. He heard guards scrambling to cut off his escape routes. He was 20 feet from the bottom when his handhold gave way. He fell, hit the slope hard, and tumbled the rest of the way down. He landed in a heap at the base of the cliff, dazed and hurting, but miraculously nothing broken. Above him, guards were starting to climb down. He forced himself to his feet and ran, ignoring the pain, focusing only on getting distance between himself and pursuit. He ran for 2 hours before the adrenaline wore off and the pain became too much to ignore. He found a hidden crevice in the rocks and collapsed into it, gasping for breath, taking inventory of his injuries. Bruised ribs, maybe cracked. His left arm was badly scraped and bleeding. His ankle was swollen, probably sprained, but he was alive. And he had the information Hayes needed. He wrapped his arm as best he could and fashioned a support for his ankle, using strips torn from his shirt. Then he forced himself to keep moving. The rally point was 6 miles away. He had to make it by nightfall, or Hayes would assume he was dead and launch the assault with incomplete intelligence. Each step was agony, but he kept going. The sun set, darkness fell, and still he walked. He could hear pursuit behind him occasionally. They were still hunting him, probably with dogs now. But he'd been running from trackers since before those guards were born. He knew how to cover his trail, how to use water and rock to confuse dogs, how to move in ways that left minimal sign. Finally, 3 hours after full dark, he stumbled into the rally point. Samuel saw him first and ran forward to catch him as his legs gave out. "Dear God, Ezra, what happened?" "Got spotted," Ezra managed. "Coming down." "They're hunting me, maybe 2 hours behind." Hayes and the other rangers gathered around. "Did you get the intelligence?" Hayes asked. "All of it." Ezra let them help him to a sitting position. "But it's bad." "Worse than we thought." He told them everything. The guard positions, the family locations, the western trail that was their best point of entry, and the mass graves, the systematic murder of workers who couldn't keep up. Hayes listened without interrupting, his face growing grimmer with each detail. When Ezra finished, the sergeant nodded. "You've given us what we need." "Good work, Cole. Now let's get you looked at." One of the rangers, who had medical training, examined Ezra's injuries and pronounced them painful but not life-threatening. They bandaged his arm properly and wrapped his ankle. "You need rest," the ranger said. "No time," Hayes replied. "If they're hunting Cole, they know something's wrong. Cord will tighten his defenses, maybe even start eliminating the hostages to remove evidence." He looked at his team. "We move tonight. Full company assault, coordinated with the other raids. Send the signal." One of the rangers pulled out a mirror and began flashing coded signals towards Santa Fe, where Captain Mitchell waited with the main force. Samuel crouched next to Ezra. "You did it. Gave us what we need." "I saw the graves, Samuel. Dozens of people, maybe hundreds, over the time they've been operating. We have to stop this. We will." Samuel's face was set with determination. "Whatever it takes, we end this tonight." As the rangers prepared for the assault, Ezra insisted on going with them, despite his injuries. Hayes tried to refuse, but Ezra was adamant. "I know that canyon better than any of you now. I know where the families are, how to get to them, where the real dangers lie. You need me." Hayes studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right, but you're not fighting. You're guiding." "Understood." "Understood." The hand-drawn tactical map Ezra had created sat spread out before them, every detail he'd observed carefully marked. Guard positions, entry points, the location of Silas Cord's headquarters, the family quarters, the mass graves. Everything was there. Hayes traced the plan with his finger. "Alpha team goes up the western trail here, takes out the guards on the rim quietly. Bravo team waits at the main entrance until Alpha signals, then hits hard and loud, draws all attention. Charlie team, that's us, we go in through the eastern approach while they're distracted. Get to the families, get them out." It was a solid plan. But everyone knew it could fall apart the moment first contact was made. Plans always did. "One more thing," Ezra said. "Silas Cord. He's ex-military, smart, experienced. If he realizes what's happening, he'll try to kill the hostages rather than let them be rescued as witnesses. Someone needs to get to him fast." "That'll be me," Hayes said. "Once we're inside, I'll take 2 men and go straight for Cord's headquarters. We stop him, the rest falls apart." As midnight approached, the rangers blackened their faces with charcoal, checked their weapons one final time, and moved out in silence. Captain Mitchell's main force was moving into position from the south. Rangers from 2 other companies were approaching from the east and west. In total, over 50 lawmen were converging on the canyon fortress, but Ezra knew that numbers weren't everything. Cord's men had the advantage of position, familiarity with the terrain, and hostages they could use as leverage or kill out of spite. This would be bloody. People would die, both rangers and hostages. The question was how many, and whether they could stop Cord before he made his final, desperate move. As they moved through the darkness toward the canyon, Ezra felt the weight of his deputy ranger badge inside his vest. He'd accepted it as a courtesy, a symbol, not really believing he'd need it. Now it felt like a responsibility. These families, these trapped and brutalized people, they were counting on him and Samuel and Hayes and all the other rangers who were risking their lives tonight. He wouldn't let them down. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, those families would be freed. The canyon loomed before them in the darkness, its walls black against the stars. Somewhere inside, Silas Cord and his men waited, unaware that their time had finally run out. The reckoning was here. Alpha Team moved first, beginning their climb up the western trail in total darkness. Ezra watched them go, these shadows moving silently up the treacherous path he'd identified. They had 2 hours to get into position before the assault began. 2 hours to climb, to reach the rim, to neutralize the guards there without raising alarm. Hayes led Charlie Team, Ezra, Samuel, and 3 other rangers toward the eastern cleft. The climb would be harder at night, more dangerous, but it was their only chance to reach the family quarters without fighting through the entire camp. Ezra's injured ankle screamed with every step, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. He'd made this climb twice before. He could make it once more. They reached the base of the cliff, and Hayes looked up, trying to gauge the route in the darkness. "You're sure about this, Cole?" "As sure as I can be. The handholds are solid for the first 100 feet. After that it gets tricky." Ezra pointed to a barely visible ledge about halfway up. "We rest there, make sure everyone's still together, then push for the top." Hayes nodded and signaled the others. They began to climb. Ezra went first, despite his injuries, because he knew the route. His hands found holds by memory as much as sight. Behind him, he could hear the others following, their breathing controlled, no unnecessary sound. His ankle gave him trouble on the steeper sections, forcing him to rely more on his arms. The pain was intense, but he channeled it into focus. Pain meant he was alive. Pain meant he could still move, still act, still help. They'd been climbing for 20 minutes when Ezra heard something that made his blood freeze, voices above. Guards on the rim, closer than they should be. He held up a hand, signaling a halt. The team pressed themselves against the rock face, motionless. Ezra could see the glow of a cigarette maybe 40 feet above them. 2 guards, possibly 3, talking quietly in the darkness. If they looked down, if they happened to shine a light at just the wrong angle. The guards talked for what felt like an eternity. They were discussing something mundane, complaining about the food, wondering when they'd get paid next. Normal conversation between working men, oblivious to the threat crawling up the wall beneath them. Finally, they moved on, their voices fading. Ezra let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and signaled the team to continue. They reached the ledge and paused to rest. Ezra checked his pocket watch, 1 hour and 15 minutes until the assault began. They were behind schedule. The rest of the climb would have to be faster, which meant more risk. Samuel leaned close and whispered, "How's the ankle?" "Doesn't matter. We keep going." The final section was the worst. The rock was looser here, handholds less certain. Twice, chunks of stone broke away and fell, clattering down the cliff face. Each time, the team froze, waiting to see if anyone had heard. Each time, they got lucky. Ezra pulled himself over the rim, with his arms shaking from exertion. He lay flat, breathing hard, waiting for the others. One by one, they came over the edge. Samuel, then the 3 rangers, and finally Hayes. They were in. From this position, Ezra could see across part of the canyon. Campfires burned in the main work area. A few guards walked patrols, but most of the camp seemed quiet. They didn't know what was coming. Hayes checked his watch. 30 minutes. We need to get into position near the family quarters. They moved through the shadows, using the canyon's irregular terrain for cover. Ezra led them along a route he'd memorized during his reconnaissance, avoiding open areas, staying low when they had to cross exposed ground. They were 50 yards from the family quarters when a guard stepped out from behind a supply tent, directly into their path. For a moment, everyone froze. The guard's eyes widened as he registered what he was seeing. Armed men, faces blackened, moving with purpose through the camp. His hand started toward his rifle. Hayes moved faster. He closed the distance in 3 steps and struck the guard with the butt of his rifle. The man went down hard and didn't move. "Bind him," Hayes ordered. Gag him, quickly. 2 rangers moved to comply while the rest kept watch. Ezra's heart was pounding. They'd gotten lucky. The guard hadn't raised alarm, but their time was running out. If anyone came looking for that guard, if anyone happened to see them, done, one of the rangers whispered. They moved on, even more cautiously now. The family quarters were in sight, a row of rough-built structures that looked more like prison barracks than proper housing. Guards stood at 2 corners, but they were looking outward, watching for external threats, not expecting danger from within the camp. Hayes positioned his team in cover and checked his watch again. 5 minutes. When shooting starts, we move. Cole, Samuel, you're with me. We go in, secure the families, get them to that eastern cleft. The rest of you provide covering fire and hold this position until we're clear. Everyone nodded. Weapons were checked one final time. Ezra drew his father's revolver, feeling its familiar weight. He thought about all the times this weapon had been used to protect the innocent, going back to his father's service in the Mexican War. Tonight, it would serve that purpose once more. The minutes ticked by in agonizing slowness. Ezra watched the guards, watched the family's quarters, watched for any sign that their presence had been detected. Everything remained quiet. Then, exactly on time, gunfire erupted from the canyon's entrance. The sound was like thunder in the confined space, echoing off the walls. Bravo team had begun their assault. Immediately, the entire camp exploded into chaos. Guards ran toward the entrance. Workers scrambled for cover. Officers shouted orders, and up on the western rim, Ezra saw muzzle flashes as Alpha Team opened fire on the guards there. Now, Hayes shouted. They rushed the family quarters. The 2 corner guards spun toward them, bringing up their rifles, but Samuel and Hayes fired first. Both guards went down. Hayes kicked open the door of the first building. U.S. Rangers, everyone stay calm. We're here to get you out. Inside, families cowered in fear, unsure if this was rescue or execution. Ezra pushed past Hayes and raised his voice. Thomas Brennan sent us. He's safe in Silver Creek. We're taking you to him. That got their attention. A woman stood up, clutching 2 children. Thomas is alive? Alive and well, but we need to move now. Gather everyone, quickly. The families poured out of the buildings, maybe 40 people total, just as Ezra had estimated. They were thin, frightened, but hope blazed in their eyes. Hope that this nightmare was finally ending. Hayes pointed toward the eastern cleft. That way. Go now, run. They ran, parents carrying children, the strong helping the weak. Samuel and 2 rangers led them, while Hayes, Ezra, and the remaining ranger provided rear security. Bullets started to fly their way as Cord's guards realized what was happening. One of the rangers went down with a cry, clutching his leg. Ezra grabbed him and half-carried, half-dragged him toward cover. Can you shoot? Ezra asked. The ranger nodded through gritted teeth. Just prop me up. Ezra positioned him behind a barrel and handed him his rifle. Buy us time. The ranger immediately began returning fire, while Ezra ran to catch up with the families. They were moving too slowly, too bunched up. If the guards got organized, if they brought concentrated fire to bear, an explosion rocked the canyon. Ezra looked back and saw flames rising from what must have been an ammunition depot. Captain Mitchell's main force was inside now, wreaking havoc on Cord's defenses. But it also meant the situation was devolving into chaos. In chaos, innocent people died. He reached the cliff edge where the families were starting to descend. Samuel was already partway down, helping people, showing them where to step. But it was taking too long. At this rate, they'd still be exposed when Cord's forces regrouped. Faster, Ezra urged. I know it's frightening, but you have to move faster. A young mother hesitated at the edge, her infant clutched to her chest. I can't, I'll fall. You won't fall. I promise you won't fall. Ezra took her hand and guided it to the first handhold. One step at a time. I'll be right behind you. She started down, trembling but determined. Others followed. The children were actually fastest, their lighter weight and natural agility serving them well. Hayes appeared beside Ezra. Cord's forces are falling back to his headquarters. Mitchell's got them in a fighting retreat, but... He paused as more gunfire erupted nearby. Cord might try to blow the whole place. He's got explosives stored throughout the canyon. If he decides he can't win, he might decide nobody wins. Ezra looked at the families still waiting to descend, then at the chaos spreading through the canyon. How long do we have? Minutes, maybe. I don't know. A decision point. They could continue the methodical evacuation, getting everyone safely down the cliff, but risking Cord's final desperate act. Or go after him, Ezra said. You and your best men? Stop Cord before he can blow the charges. I'll get these families out. Hayes looked torn. You're injured, Cole. You can barely walk. I can climb. And I can protect these people. That's all that matters. Ezra gripped Hayes's arm. You're the only one who can stop Cord. Go, we'll be fine. Hayes studied his face for a moment, then nodded. Don't get yourself killed, old man. Samuel would never forgive me. He ran back toward the fighting, taking 2 rangers with him. Ezra turned his attention back to the families. Half were down now, with Samuel guiding them from below. But half remained, and the fighting was getting closer. A bullet whined past Ezra's head. He turned to see 3 of Cord's guards approaching, firing as they came. He raised his revolver and fired back, forcing them to take cover. Keep moving, he shouted to the families. Don't stop. He provided covering fire while they descended, his revolver barking 3 times, 4 times. 1 guard went down. The others pulled back, calling for reinforcements. Ezra reloaded with practiced hands, his fingers moving automatically despite the stress. This was it, the moment where everything hung in the balance. If he could hold this position just a few more minutes, if Hayes could reach Cord in time, if the families could get down the cliff, too many ifs, too many variables. But this was what he'd signed up for. This was why he'd come out of his mountain hermitage, why he'd pinned on that deputy ranger badge. Some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth dying for. The families kept descending into the darkness below, toward safety, toward freedom, toward a future that had almost been stolen from them. And Ezra Cole, 62 years old and 20 years past his prime, stood at the top of that cliff and refused to let anyone stop them. 6 weeks later, Ezra stood on his cabin porch, looking out over the valley he'd called home for 20 years. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made you grateful to be alive. His ankle had healed, though it still ached in cold weather. The other injuries had faded to memories and scars, but the real changes weren't physical. They were deeper, more fundamental. The mountains were still beautiful, the solitude still peaceful, but they no longer felt like a refuge from the world. They felt like home, a place he could return to but not hide in. He heard horses approaching and smiled. Samuel had sent word yesterday that he'd be coming by with news. Ezra had baked bread that morning, the first time he'd bothered with such hospitality in years. Samuel rode up with another man Ezra didn't recognize at first. Then the stranger dismounted and Ezra saw his face clearly. Thomas Brennan, Ezra said, surprised and pleased. Last I heard you were settling in Silver Creek with your family. We did, sir. Got a small farm there now, good land, fair price. Thomas extended his hand and they shook warmly. But I couldn't settle proper without coming to thank you one more time, and to bring you something. From his saddlebag, Thomas pulled out a wooden box, carefully crafted with dovetail joints and a smooth finish. He handed it to Ezra. Made it myself. Took me 3 weeks to get it right. My daughter Sarah, she insisted it had to be perfect. Ezra opened the box. Inside, nestled in cloth, was a new wooden toy. Not a horse this time, but a carving of a mountain man standing beside a cabin, looking out over a valley. The detail was remarkable, better than Ezra would have expected from a farmer's hands. I did some woodworking before everything happened, Thomas explained. Lost my tools in the chaos, but I've been building up my workshop again. Sarah said you needed something to remember us by. She was very insistent about that. Ezra felt his throat tighten. It's beautiful work, Thomas. Please tell Sarah I'll treasure it. You can tell her yourself. She's out by the road with her mother and sisters. They wanted to come, but I wasn't sure if you'd welcome a crowd. Bring them up, Ezra said immediately. Please. Thomas whistled, and his family appeared from the tree line, his wife and 3 daughters, all looking healthy and well-fed. Nothing like the frightened people he'd last seen, scrambling down a cliff face in the darkness. Little Sarah ran ahead of the others and stopped in front of Ezra, suddenly shy. Then she held out something, the wooden toy horse he'd returned to her in the tunnels. "I want you to keep him too," she said solemnly, "so he can be friends with the mountain man." Ezra knelt down, ignoring the protest from his healing ankle. "Are you sure? That's your special toy. Papa made me a new one, and you saved us, so you should have the old one. For luck." He took the horse carefully and set it beside the carved mountain man. They fit together perfectly, as if Thomas had planned it that way. "Thank you. Sarah, I'll take good care of him," she smiled, then hugged him quickly before running back to her mother. They all came up to the cabin, and Ezra found himself serving coffee and bread to a crowd for the first time in 20 years. The conversation flowed easily. Talk of the farm, of the trials that were ongoing in Santa Fe, of the other families who'd been rescued and where they'd settled. "There's going to be a memorial," Thomas's wife mentioned, "for all the people who didn't make it. They're still excavating the graves, identifying remains. It'll be a year at least before they're done. But when they are, there'll be a proper ceremony. You should come." "I will," Ezra promised. After the Brennans left, Samuel stayed behind. He pulled out an official-looking document from his saddlebag. "Captain Mitchell wanted me to deliver this personally." Ezra unfolded the paper. It was a formal commendation from the Texas Rangers, signed by the captain and countersigned by the territorial governor. It praised his courage, his skill, and his dedication to justice. It also contained an offer, a permanent position as a ranger consultant to be called upon when his particular skills were needed. "You don't have to accept," Samuel said. "Mitchell knows you value your solitude, but if you ever want to help again, the option is there." Ezra read through the document twice, thinking about what it meant. A connection to the world, a purpose beyond simple survival, a way to honor his father's legacy and his wife's values. "Tell Mitchell I accept, but on my terms. I stay here in my cabin. When you need me, you know where to find me." Samuel grinned. "He expected you'd say that. In fact, he told me to tell you that's exactly what he was hoping for." They sat on the porch together, drinking coffee, watching the afternoon sun paint the mountains in gold and shadow. It was comfortable, this friendship they'd forged in crisis. Different from what Ezra had had with Sarah or with his old army companions, but real nonetheless. "I'm heading back to Pinewood tomorrow," Samuel said. "Store's been closed too long. Plus there's a new deputy marshal starting next week. Actual honest lawman this time. I want to be there to make sure he settles in right. Will you keep working undercover?" "For a while yet. Mitchell thinks there's still corruption to root out, just not as organized as Blackwood's consortium." "It'll take time." Samuel looked at Ezra. "You could come to town more often, you know. People have heard about what you did." "You'd be welcome. Maybe I will. Once a month seems less necessary now." "Maybe once a week wouldn't be so bad." After Samuel left, Ezra spent the evening organizing his cabin. He found a place of honor for the carved mountain man and the toy horse on his shelf, next to his journal and his father's revolver. The four objects together told a story: solitude, duty, innocence, and redemption. He opened his journal to a fresh page and began to write. Not about his observations of nature this time, but about the past weeks. About the hidden valley and the families he'd saved. About Samuel and the Rangers. About the choice he'd made to step back into the world. The words came easily now. The isolation that had once been necessary had become a prison of his own making. But he'd found the key. Not by running further into the wilderness, but by turning around and facing what he'd been running from. As darkness fell, Ezra lit his lamp and continued writing. He wrote about Sarah and Emma, about his grief and his guilt. He wrote about the 20 years he'd spent in these mountains and what he'd learned here. He wrote about the man he'd been, the man he'd become, and the man he hoped to be going forward. When he finally set down his pen, it was near midnight. His hand was cramped from writing, but he felt lighter somehow. The words on the page had taken some of the weight he'd been carrying and transformed it into something else. Not happiness exactly, but something like peace. He stood and walked to the cabin door, opening it to look out at the night. The stars were brilliant overhead, the same stars that had watched over him for 20 years of solitude. But he wasn't the same man who'd first come to these mountains. That man had been broken, running, trying to escape himself. This man, the one standing here now, he was still carrying wounds, still bearing scars. But he'd learned that scars were just evidence of healing, and wounds could close if you gave them the chance. Somewhere in Silver Creek, Thomas Brennan and his family were sleeping safely in their own home. Somewhere in Santa Fe, 40 other families were rebuilding their lives. Somewhere across the West, hundreds of people were free because of what had been done, the risks that had been taken, the duties that had been fulfilled. Ezra couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't undo the years he'd lost to grief. It couldn't change the past or erase his regrets. But he could honor the memory of those he'd lost by living in a way that would have made them proud. Sarah had always said that love wasn't just about holding on. It was also about letting go. Letting go of fear, of grief, of the need to control everything. Letting go so that life could flow through you instead of battering against you. He understood that now, finally. After all these years, Ezra Cole closed his door against the cold night air and returned to his table. He picked up the new journal Samuel had given him weeks ago, still mostly empty, still waiting to be filled. He opened it to the first page and wrote a simple sentence: "Today I chose to live again." Then he set down the pen, extinguished the lamp, and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. There would be more struggles, more pain, more loss. That was the nature of living. But there would also be more moments like today, reunions with people he'd saved, friendships that mattered, purposes that gave life meaning. There would be mornings when the coffee tasted especially good, and evenings when the sunset painted the mountains in colors too beautiful for words. There would be the satisfaction of work well done, and the quiet comfort of knowing he'd made a difference. His solitude was no longer an escape. It was a choice, freely made, that gave him strength to engage with the world when engagement was needed. The mountains were no longer his prison. They were his home, his sanctuary, his place of rest between battles. And when Samuel or Captain Mitchell came calling, when the next crisis arrived, when people needed help that only he could provide, he would be ready, because Ezra Cole had finally learned what his wife had tried to teach him all those years ago, that the measure of a life wasn't in how much pain you could avoid, but in how much good you could do despite the pain. That healing didn't mean forgetting the past, but learning to carry it without being crushed by it, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply choose to keep living. Keep trying, keep caring, even when it hurt, even when it was hard, even when you weren't sure you had the strength. The mountains stood eternal in the darkness outside his cabin. The stars wheeled overhead. And Ezra Cole, no longer a man running from his past, but a man walking toward his future, slept peacefully in the home he'd built with his own hands. 20 years and a lifetime ago. Tomorrow, he would wake to a new day. And whatever that day brought, he would face it not as a hermit hiding from the world, but as a man who'd found his place in it once more. The gap in the forest had revealed more than a hidden valley. It had revealed a path back to himself. And for that revelation, painful as it had been to walk that path, Ezra was grateful. Sometimes the life you choose to escape the world becomes the very thing that prepares you to return to it. And sometimes, in your darkest isolation, you discover the light that guides you home.